The day Nora Gray collapsed on Elias Ward's land, she had been walking for 3 days straight with nothing but prairie dust in her lungs and her dying son in her arms. She didn't know the silent rancher who found her would become her salvation, or that his proposal would be the strangest, most honest thing anyone had ever offered her. This is the story of two broken people who built a family from nothing but necessity and something fiercer than love, the will to survive together. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The sun had no mercy that afternoon. It hung like a brass coin in the bleached sky, beating down on the Oklahoma prairie with the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance like water that wasn't there. The red dirt road stretched endlessly in both directions, cutting through dried grassland that whispered and rattled in the hot wind. Nothing moved except the heat waves and the occasional tumbling of sagebrush across the hardpan earth. Then, a figure appeared on the horizon. At first it was just a dark smudge against the glare, wavering in the heat mirage. But as minutes crawled by, the shape resolved itself into a woman, thin, exhausted, carrying something in her arms. Her dress, once perhaps a respectable calico blue, was now gray with road dust and stained with sweat. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in tangled ropes down her back. But it was her walk that told the real story. The stumbling, determined shuffle of someone who had been moving forward only because stopping meant death. Nora Gray had been walking for 3 days. 3 days since the boarding house in Tulsa had thrown her out for lack of payment. 3 days since she'd spent her last nickel on a piece of bread she'd softened with water and fed to her son in tiny portions. 3 days since she'd slept anywhere but the side of the road, curled around her boy to keep the night chill off him. Her arms ached with the weight of him. Tommy was 4 years old and small for his age. Hunger had seen to that. But even a small child becomes heavy after miles of carrying. His head lolled against her shoulder, his breathing shallow and hot. Fever. He'd been burning up since yesterday evening, and Nora had no medicine, no money, no way to help him except to keep walking towards something, anything that might offer shelter. "Mama," Tommy whimpered against her neck. His voice was barely a whisper. "Mama, I'm thirsty." "I know, baby, I know." Nora's own voice cracked. Her lips were split and bleeding, her throat so dry that swallowing felt like dragging sandpaper down her gullet. Just a little further, just a little more. It was a lie, and she knew it. She had no idea where she was or where she was going. The people in the last town, what was it called? She couldn't remember, had made it clear that a widow woman with a fatherless child wasn't welcome. The shopkeeper had refused her when she'd tried to trade her wedding ring for food. "That thing ain't worth $1, he'd sneered, "and we don't give charity to women of your kind." Your kind. As if widowhood were a moral failing. As if losing James to the influenza made her somehow less than human. Nora's vision blurred, and for a moment she wasn't sure if it was tears or the heat playing tricks. She blinked hard, forcing herself to focus. Ahead, the road curved slightly, and beyond it, was that a structure? Or just another cruel mirage? She squinted, barely daring to hope. Buildings. Real buildings, not phantoms conjured by her desperate mind. A house, a barn, corrals, the dark shapes of cattle in a distant pasture. A ranch. "Tommy," she breathed. "Tommy, baby, look. There's a place, someone who might help us." The boy stirred weakly but didn't lift his head. His small body was furnace hot against hers, and terror seized Nora's heart in a cold fist. He was getting worse. If she didn't find help soon, she wouldn't finish that thought, couldn't. Nora forced her legs to move faster, though they trembled with exhaustion and threatened to buckle with each step. The ranch grew larger as she approached, and she could make out more details now. A solid 2-story house with a wraparound porch, painted white but weathered by years of prairie sun and wind. The barn was enormous, red paint fading to rust in patches. Split rail fences marked out paddocks where a few horses stood motionless in the shade. Everything looked well-maintained but somehow empty, as if the place were holding its breath. There were no people visible anywhere. Nora reached the gate, a simple wooden affair hanging between 2 posts, and stood there swaying, gathering what little remained of her strength. Her pride, the last thing she had left besides her son, warred with her desperation. She had never begged in her life, never asked for charity. James had always provided, and after he died, she'd worked her fingers raw, taking in washing, mending, anything to keep them fed and housed. But now there was nothing left. No pride, no options, no time. She pushed through the gate. The ranch yard was packed earth, swept clean. A water pump stood near the house, and the sight of it made Nora's throat constrict with desperate thirst. But she forced herself past it, climbing the 3 steps to the porch with legs that barely obeyed her. She raised one shaking hand and knocked on the door. The sound was pathetically weak, barely audible. She knocked again, harder, using the last of her strength. Nothing. "Please," Nora whispered, then louder. "Please. Is anyone home? My son is sick. Please. I just need—" Her legs gave out. She caught herself on the porch railing, but the movement jostled Tommy, and he cried out, a thin, painful sound that cut through her like a knife. Nora's knees hit the wooden planks hard enough to bruise, but she barely felt it. She was beyond feeling anything but terror for her child. "Please," she sobbed, not even sure anymore if she was calling to the empty house or to God himself. "Please, somebody help us." The barn door opened. The sound of it, the creak of old hinges, the scrape of wood on wood, made Nora's head snap up. A man stood in the barn's shadowed entrance, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the brim of a weather-beaten hat. For a long moment he didn't move, and Nora had the irrational thought that perhaps he wasn't real, that desperation had finally broken her mind and conjured help where none existed. Then he stepped forward into the sunlight, and she saw him clearly. He was perhaps 40, with the weathered, sun-darkened skin of a man who'd spent his life outdoors. His face was all hard angles, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, a straight nose that looked like it had been broken once and healed slightly crooked. But it was his eyes that struck her, dark and watchful, holding an expression she couldn't quite read. Not hostile, but not welcoming either. Guarded, she thought, like a man who'd learned not to trust easily. Elias Ward had been mending tack in the barn when he heard the knocking. At first he'd ignored it, probably another traveling salesman or missionary trying to sell him something he didn't need or save a soul he'd long since written off as lost. He'd let them knock and give up, same as always. But then he heard the woman's voice, the desperation in it, the plea for help. And then he heard her fall. His hands had stilled on the bridle he was working, his jaw tightening. Every instinct told him to stay where he was, to not get involved. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. Caring about people only led to pain when you inevitably lost them. Better to stay alone, to need nothing and no one, to let the world roll by without touching him. But the woman's sobs carried across the yard, raw and broken, and beneath them, the thin cry of a child. A child. Elias's chest constricted. His eyes moved unbidden to the corner of the barn where a small wooden cradle sat, draped with canvas to keep the dust off. He hadn't looked at it in 5 years, hadn't touched it, hadn't been able to make himself throw it away, or burn it, or do anything with it except hide it and pretend it didn't exist. The child cried again. Before he'd made a conscious decision, Elias was moving. He set down the bridle with careful precision, as if maintaining that small amount of order could keep the chaos at bay, and walked to the barn door. He pulled it open and stepped out into the brutal afternoon heat. The woman was on his porch, on her knees, clutching a small boy against her chest. Even from this distance, Elias could see she was at the end of her rope, gaunt, sunburned, swaying even while kneeling. The boy in her arms looked worse, limp and fever-flushed. Elias stood frozen for a moment, decades of carefully constructed walls, warring with something more primal, something he thought he'd buried along with his wife and the child they'd lost. Then he was moving across the yard with long, quick strides. Nora heard his boots on the hard-packed earth and looked up. Her vision swam, but she could make out his shape approaching. She tried to stand, failed, and instead clutched Tommy tighter as if sheer will could protect him from whatever was coming. "Please," she managed. "My son, he needs water. He's burning up. I don't have any money, but I can work. I'm a hard worker. I can clean, cook, anything. Please, just help him. Please." Elias stopped a few feet away, looking down at them. Up close, he could see the woman was young, late 20s perhaps, though hardship had carved lines around her eyes and mouth. Her dress was threadbare, her shoes held together with string. The boy in her arms couldn't have been more than 4 or 5, his small face red with fever, his breathing rapid and shallow. "How long has he been sick?" Elias's voice was rough from disuse. He spoke so rarely these days that sometimes whole weeks passed without him saying more than a few words to the hands who worked his cattle. "Since yesterday." Nora's words tumbled over each other. "Maybe longer. I don't know, we've been walking, and I didn't have... When did he last drink?" "This morning. A little. From a stream. But it was muddy, and I think..." Her voice broke. "I think maybe that made it worse." Elias's jaw tightened. Bad water on top of heat exhaustion and what looked like at least a week of malnutrition. The boy needed help, and fast. He made a decision. "Come inside." He turned toward the house without waiting for a response. Nora blinked, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "Inside." Elias climbed the porch steps and opened the door, holding it with one hand while he looked back at her. "Bring the boy. I've got clean water and medicine." For a heartbeat, Nora didn't move. She'd learned to be wary of men who offered help. There was almost always a price, and it was rarely one she could afford to pay. But Tommy whimpered against her neck, his small body shaking with chills despite the heat, and she realized she was out of choices. She struggled to her feet, her legs nearly giving out again. Elias watched her sway, then set his jaw and came back down the steps. Without a word, he bent and scooped Tommy out of her arms with surprising gentleness for such a large man. "Wait!" Nora's maternal instinct flared despite her exhaustion. "What are you... Your boy needs water and medicine, and you're about to collapse. Unless you want both of you dead on my porch, move." His tone was brusque, but not unkind. Tommy didn't even stir at the transfer, his small body limp in Elias's arms. That more than anything convinced Nora to follow the stranger into his house. The interior was dim and blessedly cool after the inferno outside. Nora had a vague impression of simple furniture, everything clean but Spartan, before Elias was moving through the front room toward what looked like a kitchen. He shouldered through a door, and Nora followed on shaking legs. The kitchen was large, dominated by a cast-iron stove and a sturdy table. Elias laid Tommy on the table with careful precision, then moved to a pump at the sink. He worked the handle, and after a few creaking protests, clear water gushed forth. He filled a tin cup and brought it back to the table. "Hold his head," he instructed Nora. She obeyed, cradling Tommy's skull gently while Elias brought the cup to the boy's cracked lips. Water dribbled into his mouth, and for a terrible moment, Tommy didn't respond. Then his throat worked in a weak swallow, and he made a small sound, almost a whimper of relief. "That's it," Elias murmured, his voice dropping to something softer. "Easy now, not too fast." He let the boy drink in small sips, patient and unhurried. Nora watched his hands, large, calloused, scarred from years of ranch work, handle her son with unexpected tenderness. When Tommy had drunk perhaps half the cup, Elias pulled it away despite the boy's weak protest. "Too much at once will make him sick," he explained, setting the cup aside. He placed a broad hand on Tommy's forehead and his mouth tightened. "He's burning up. You got a name?" "Nora. Nora Gray. And this is Thomas." "Tommy." Her voice shook. Will he... Fever's high, but I've seen worse." Elias moved to a cabinet and pulled out a brown bottle and a clean cloth. "We'll get some willow bark tea in him, cool him down with wet cloths. He's young and tough. Should pull through." Should, not will. But it was more hope than Nora had allowed herself in days, and she clung to it like a lifeline. Elias worked with quiet efficiency, steeping the willow bark in hot water, then cooling it enough for the boy to drink. He got several spoonfuls down Tommy's throat, then soaked the cloth in cool water and laid it across the child's forehead. All the while he said little, his face set in grim concentration. Nora swayed on her feet, watching. The relief of being out of the sun, of seeing her son finally getting care, made the adrenaline that had been keeping her upright drain away all at once. The room tilted. "Sit." Elias's hand closed around her elbow, steadying her. He guided her to a chair with the same careful handling he'd shown Tommy. "When did you last eat?" Yesterday? No, the day before. I had some bread, but I gave most of it to Tommy." The words came out thick and slow, her mind fogging now that the immediate crisis was being managed by someone else. Elias said nothing, but his expression darkened. He moved to the stove, where a pot sat with what smelled like beef stew. He ladled out a bowl, set it in front of her with a spoon, and simply said, "Eat." Pride flickered weakly in Nora's chest. "I can't. I don't have money to pay you. Not now, but I meant what I said. I can work. I'm strong, and I'm good with eat first, talk after." Elias's tone brooked no argument. Nora looked down at the bowl. The stew was thick with vegetables and chunks of beef, and the smell of it made her stomach clench with desperate hunger. Her hand shook as she picked up the spoon. The first bite was transcendent. She barely tasted it before swallowing, then took another and another. Some distant part of her knew she should eat slowly, that her empty stomach might rebel, but she couldn't stop. She was halfway through the bowl before she realized she was crying, tears dripping silently into the stew. Elias had turned away, ostensibly to check on Tommy again, but really to give the woman some privacy for her breakdown. He refreshed the cloth on the boy's forehead, checked his breathing, and tried to ignore the sound of quiet weeping behind him. He didn't like this. Didn't like having people in his house, disrupting the careful emptiness he'd cultivated. Didn't like the way the boy's small face reminded him of things he'd worked years to forget. Didn't like the protective instinct that had surged through him when he'd seen them collapsed on his porch. But he couldn't turn them away. Whatever his failings, and Lord knew he had plenty, Elias Ward had never been the kind of man who could ignore someone in need, even if it would be easier, even if it would hurt less. Behind him, Nora's crying subsided to hiccuping breaths. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I don't normally—" "Finish eating," Elias said, still not turning around. "Then you can tell me how you ended up on my land half dead with a sick child." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't cruel either. Just a statement of fact, delivered in that same flat, emotionless tone he seemed to use for everything. Nora finished the stew, scraping the bowl clean with shaking hands. The food sat heavy and warm in her stomach, making her realize just how close to the edge she'd been. Another day, maybe two, and she would have collapsed for real, and Tommy would have— She couldn't finish that thought. "Thank you," she said quietly. Words aren't enough, but thank you." Elias finally turned back to her. His dark eyes studied her for a long moment, taking in her gaunt face, her worn-down appearance, the desperate gratitude written in every line of her body. Then he nodded once, sharp and brief. "Your boy will sleep for a while. The willow bark will help the fever come down, but he needs rest and more water when he wakes. You look like you could use the same." "I can sleep in the barn," Nora said quickly. "I don't want to impose, and I meant what I said about working. Just tell me what needs doing, and There's a spare room upstairs, take it." Elias moved toward the kitchen door, clearly ending the conversation. "We'll talk about work and payment when you're both recovered. For now, just rest." "But Mrs. Gray?" He paused at the doorway, his back to her. "I'm not a good man, and I'm not kind. But I'm practical. You and your boy are no use to me dead or sick. So you'll rest, you'll recover, and then we'll figure out what comes next. Understand?" It was the longest speech he'd made, and it was delivered in that same flat tone, as if he were discussing the weather or the price of cattle. But something in it, maybe the brutal honesty, maybe the acknowledgement that there would be a "what comes next," made Nora's throat close up. "I understand," she managed. "Good." Elias walked out, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Nora sat alone in the kitchen with her sleeping son on the table beside her, and for the first time in months, maybe years, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they might survive after all. The spare room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the prairie. Elias had carried Tommy up and laid him on the bed while Nora followed, her legs barely making the stairs. He'd left them with fresh water, more willow bark tea, and instructions to call if the boy worsened. Then he'd retreated to the barn, where he belonged. Now, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Elias stood in the barn's dim interior and stared at nothing. His hands were busy. They were always busy, always working, always moving, because if they stopped, he'd have to think, cleaning and oiling tack that didn't need it. What the hell had he done? He'd promised himself after Sarah died that he wouldn't let anyone close again. Wouldn't care. Wouldn't risk the kind of gut-wrenching agony that came from loving someone and losing them. And for 5 years, he'd kept that promise. He'd run his ranch, worked until exhaustion made sleep possible, and avoided the town and its people as much as he could. And now he had a woman and child under his roof. A woman with haunted eyes and a desperation that reminded him too much of Sarah in those final days, when the fever took her and there was nothing he could do but watch her slip away. A boy with his son's coloring, burning with fever just like... No. Elias shut that thought down hard. Tommy wasn't his son, would never be his son. The boy was just a stranger's child who happened to get sick at the wrong time, and Nora Gray was just a woman who needed help. He'd give them a few days to recover, maybe offer her some work to earn supplies and money for wherever she was headed next, and then they'd be gone. That was the plan. Simple, practical, safe. So why did his chest feel tight every time he thought about them leaving? Fool, Elias muttered to himself, attacking a stirrup with the oil rag harder than necessary. Damn fool. Upstairs in the house, Nora sat beside Tommy's bed and watched her son sleep. The fever hadn't broken yet, but it hadn't gotten worse either, and his breathing seemed easier. She'd been sponging him with cool water every hour, getting him to drink when he stirred, following the rancher's instructions to the letter. The rancher. Elias Ward. She'd seen his name on a piece of mail on the kitchen table. She knew almost nothing about him, except that he lived alone, spoke little, and had saved their lives without asking for anything in return. Yet, Nora had learned that kindness usually came with a price tag. Men didn't just help women for nothing, especially not women like her, widowed, penniless, with a child and no prospects. There would be expectations. There were always expectations. But what choice did she have? She'd been at the end of her rope when she stumbled onto this ranch, and if Elias Ward wanted payment she couldn't afford, well, she'd figure that out when it came. For now, Tommy was safe and cool and sleeping in a real bed, and that was worth almost any price. Almost. Nora's hand drifted unconsciously to her throat, where James's ring hung on a thin chain. She'd been too afraid to wear it on her finger while traveling, afraid someone would steal it, or that she'd have to sell it. It was all she had left of her husband, of the life they'd built before the influenza swept through Tulsa like wildfire and took him in 3 days. "I'm trying, James," she whispered to the ring, to the memory of the man she'd loved. "I'm trying so hard to keep him safe. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm trying." The ring didn't answer, of course. The dead never did. Tommy stirred, whimpering, and Nora pushed aside her melancholy to focus on her son. She dampened the cloth again and laid it on his forehead, murmuring soft reassurances until he settled back into sleep. Outside, the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The prairie grass rippled like water in the evening breeze, and the cattle lowed softly in the distance. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way, this endless land under an endless sky. Nora watched it from the window and wondered how long they'd be allowed to stay. A week? 2? And then what? Where would they go next? She had no answers. For now, all she could do was tend her son, accept the stranger's hospitality, and hope that whatever price Elias Ward eventually named would be one she could bear to pay. In the barn, Elias finished with the tack and moved to evening chores. The horses needed feeding, the stalls needed mucking, the chickens needed their coop secured against coyotes. Familiar work, routine work, the kind that didn't require thought. But even as his body went through the motions, his mind kept drifting back to the house, to the woman and child inside, to the way Tommy's small hand had clutched at his shirt when he'd carried him upstairs, seeking comfort even in fever-addled unconsciousness, to the desperate gratitude in Nora's eyes, like he'd handed her the world instead of just a bowl of stew and a bed. He didn't want their gratitude, didn't want to be anyone's savior, didn't want to feel the uncomfortable twist in his chest when he thought about them leaving. But he did feel it, and that was the problem. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Elias made his final rounds, checking locks, dousing the lanterns, securing the ranch for the night. At the house, he paused, looking up at the lit window of the spare room. A shadow moved past it, Nora checking on her son. He should go up there, check on the boy's fever, make sure they had everything they needed. But he didn't. Instead, Elias Ward turned away from his own house and walked back to the barn, where he climbed to the loft and laid out his bedroll in the hay. He'd sleep here tonight. And tomorrow night. For as long as they stayed, he'd give them the house and keep his distance. It was safer that way. For all of them. But as he lay in the darkness, listening to the prairie wind howl around the barn's walls, Elias couldn't shake the memory of Tommy's small, fevered face or Nora's desperate tears. And he couldn't quite convince himself that he was doing this purely out of practicality. Some part of him, the part he'd tried to bury along with his wife and unborn child, had woken up the moment he heard that woman's voice crying for help, and no amount of emotional distance or careful routine was going to put it back to sleep. Not anymore. The fever broke on the third morning. Nora woke to find Tommy's forehead cool to the touch, his breathing deep and even, his small body finally relaxed instead of rigid with chills. She sat on the edge of the bed and wept silently, her whole body shaking with relief so profound it hurt. For 3 days she'd barely slept, hovering over her son, sponging him with cool water, coaxing sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips, terrified that each breath might be his last. But he'd survived. They both had. Through it all, the rancher had appeared like clockwork, morning, noon, and evening, bringing fresh water, more medicine, simple meals that Nora forced herself to eat because she knew Tommy needed her strong. Elias never lingered, never made conversation beyond terse questions about the boy's condition. He'd check Tommy's fever with a broad hand to the forehead, nod at whatever Nora reported, and leave again, his boots heavy on the stairs. He hadn't asked her story, hadn't pressed her about payment or how long she planned to stay, hadn't made any demands at all. It was unsettling. Now, with Tommy sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, Nora allowed herself to really look at the room she'd been occupying. Simple furniture, clean but worn. A faded quilt on the bed, patched in places but carefully mended. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph on the dresser. She hadn't noticed it before, too consumed with caring for Tommy. She stood on shaky legs and crossed to examine it. The photograph showed a young woman, perhaps 20, with soft features and kind eyes. She wore a high-necked dress and held flowers, smiling at something beyond the camera's frame. Written in faded ink at the bottom, Sarah, 1895. Nora's fingers traced the frame's edge. A wife then, or had been. The past tense was written in the dust that had settled over the glass, in the way the photo faced slightly away from the room, as if someone had turned it and never turned it back. "Where did you go?" Nora whispered to the woman's image. "And why did you leave him so alone?" Downstairs, a door opened and closed. Heavy footsteps crossed the front room. Nora quickly stepped away from the photograph, feeling like she'd been caught snooping. She smoothed her dress, still her only dress, now washed in the basin and dried overnight, and tried to compose herself. She needed to go down, to thank Elias properly, to discuss what came next. The anxiety that had been held at bay by Tommy's illness now rushed back full force. She had no money, no prospects, nowhere to go. And she'd been living in this man's house for 3 days, eating his food, using his medicine. The debt was mounting, and eventually it would have to be paid. Nora checked Tommy one more time, still sleeping peacefully, then made her way downstairs on legs that trembled from more than just exhaustion. Elias stood at the kitchen stove, his back to her, stirring something in a pot. He'd removed his hat, revealing dark hair threaded with gray at the temples. His shoulders were rigid, his movements precise and controlled, as if he were holding himself together through sheer force of will. "Mr. Ward?" Nora's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. He turned, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or something softer, before his expression closed down into that now familiar guarded neutrality. "The boy?" he asked. "Better. The fever broke. He's sleeping, but it's real sleep now, not—" She gestured helplessly. "He's going to be all right, thanks to you." Elias nodded once and turned back to the stove. "Good. He'll need food when he wakes. Broth first, then we'll see if he can handle solids. Mr. Ward, Nora clasped her hands together to stop their shaking. "I need to talk to you about payment, about what I owe you. I meant what I said about working. I'm strong, and I'm a hard worker. I can clean, cook, tend animals, whatever you need. And I won't ask for wages, just room and board until the debt is settled. I know it might take a while, but I promise I'll— Mrs. Gray. Elias's voice cut through her nervous rambling. He still didn't turn around. When did your husband die? The question caught her off guard. What? Your husband. You wear a widow's dress and you've got a ring on a chain around your neck. When did he die? Nora's hand flew to her throat, to the ring hidden beneath her collar. 7 months ago. The influenza. And you've been on your own since then? You and the boy? Yes. No family? No one to take you in? James was an orphan. His parents died when he was young, and my family— Her voice hardened. My father made it clear I wasn't welcome after I married James. Said I was choosing poverty over sense. I haven't spoken to him in 5 years. Elias was quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the gentle bubbling of whatever he was cooking and the morning breeze through the open window. How'd you end up here? He finally asked. Nora swallowed hard. She didn't want to tell this story, didn't want to relive the humiliation and desperation of the past months. But he'd asked, and she owed him at least the truth. After James died, I tried to keep us going in Tulsa. I took in washing, mending, whatever work I could find, but it wasn't enough. The boarding house wanted payment I couldn't make. They threw us out 2 weeks ago. Her voice remained steady, though it cost her. I thought maybe we could get to my cousin in Kansas. She married well. I thought maybe she'd help. But the towns along the way, people don't trust a woman alone with a child. They think— She couldn't finish. They think you're a whore, Elias said bluntly. That the boy's a bastard, and you're looking for a man to take advantage of. Nora flinched at the crude words, but she couldn't deny them. Yes. And you walked. For how long? 2 weeks, maybe more. I lost track. Jesus. The word was barely a breath. Elias finally turned to face her, and his expression was no longer neutral. Something burned in his dark eyes, anger, but not at her. You walked for 2 weeks across Oklahoma in August with a 4-year-old child. No money, no food. And not one person helped you? Some did. A farmer's wife gave us bread. A preacher let us sleep in his church one night. But most— Nora lifted her chin. Most just wanted us gone. We made them uncomfortable. Elias stared at her for a long moment, and Nora forced herself not to look away. Let him see what she was, proud, desperate, determined to survive. Let him make his judgment and name his price, and she'd pay it if she could. You'll work, Elias said finally, but not to pay off a debt. I'll pay you proper wages, same as I'd pay any hand, room and board included, and wages on top. You can save up, and when you've got enough to get wherever you're heading, you'll go. Fair? Nora blinked. She'd expected many things, but not this. I don't understand. Why would you— Because I need the help, Elias interrupted. Place this size doesn't run itself. I've got 3 hands who work the cattle and handle the heavy labor, but the house is a mess and I can't cook worth a damn. You can handle the domestic work, cooking, cleaning, laundry, the vegetable garden that's been dying for lack of attention. And the boy, when he's well, can help with light chores. Feeding chickens, gathering eggs, that sort of thing. It's practical, that's all. But it wasn't all, and they both knew it. Practical would be sending them on their way with a few supplies and a pointed reminder that he wasn't a charity. This was something else. Something that made Elias's jaw tight and his eyes avoid hers. Still, Nora wasn't fool enough to question good fortune when it appeared. That's more than fair, Mr. Ward. Thank you. Elias, he said gruffly, if you're staying and working, we might as well use first names. Then you should call me Nora. He nodded, then gestured to the pot on the stove. Chicken broth. When the boy wakes, get some in him. There's bread in the box there, and eggs if you want to make breakfast. I've got work to do. He was moving toward the door, fleeing, really, when Nora's voice stopped him. Elias? He paused but didn't turn around. Why are you doing this? And please don't say it's just practical. His shoulders tensed. For a long moment, Nora thought he wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, almost too quietly to hear, because nobody helped her either, when the fever took her. And I couldn't save her. Before Nora could respond, before she could ask who her was, Though she thought she knew, Elias was gone, the screen door banging shut behind him. Nora stood alone in the kitchen of a stranger's house that was somehow now hers to manage, and felt tears prick her eyes again. Not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming realization that maybe, just maybe, there were still good people in the world, or at least people who'd known enough pain to recognize it in others. The rest of that first week passed in a careful dance of coexistence. Tommy recovered quickly, as children do, going from deathly ill to restless in the space of a few days. By the end of the week, he was begging to go outside. And Nora, after getting Elias's gruff approval, let him explore the ranch yard under strict instructions not to wander far. She watched from the kitchen window as her son discovered the joy of open space after months of being cooped up in boarding house rooms and walking endless roads. He chased chickens, though never caught them, examined every rock and stick with 4-year-old fascination, and spent an hour watching a barn cat hunt mice in the tall grass. And he watched Elias. The rancher worked constantly, moving between barn and pasture and corral with single-minded focus. He handled the horses with calm competence, mended fences with methodical precision, and did 100 other tasks that Nora couldn't even name. Tommy followed his movements with wide eyes, occasionally creeping closer when he thought no one was watching. Elias never acknowledged the boy's presence, never spoke to him or shooed him away, just worked as if Tommy didn't exist, though Nora noticed he was careful never to do anything that might be dangerous with a small child nearby. Inside, Nora threw herself into work. The house, she discovered, was clean but neglected in ways that spoke of a man who'd stopped caring about anything beyond basic function. The windows were dusty, the curtains faded, the floors swept but not scrubbed. The kitchen was serviceable but joyless, with mismatched dishes and a single pot and pan that had seen better days. She started with the kitchen, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. She washed the curtains and hung them in the sun to bleach. She found a forgotten herb garden behind the house, choked with weeds, and spent an afternoon rescuing the sage and thyme and rosemary that had survived years of neglect. And she cooked. That first proper meal, roast chicken with herbs, biscuits, and green beans from the garden, she set out at sunset, calling Elias in from whatever he was doing. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, covered in dust and sweat, and stopped short at the sight of the table set with actual plates and serving dishes instead of the usual pot he ate directly from. "What's all this?" His voice was suspicious. "Dinner," Nora said simply. "You've been working all day. Sit." "I can eat in the barn. Don't need to make a fuss." Elias Ward, "You hired me to cook, and I cooked. Now sit down and eat before it gets cold." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe amusement, but he sat. Tommy was already at the table, eyes wide at the feast before him. The boy had eaten nothing but broth and soft bread for days, and the sight of real food made him nearly vibrate with excitement. "Mama, can I have a biscuit? Mama, look how big the chicken is. Mama." "Tommy, hush and let Mr. Ward say grace." Both males looked at her in surprise. "What?" Tommy asked. Elias cleared his throat. "Haven't said grace in years, Nora." "Well, then it's past time you started." She folded her hands and bowed her head, leaving them no choice but to follow suit. The prayer was simple. Thanks for food, for health, for shelter. When Nora finished, she looked up to find Elias staring at his plate with an unreadable expression. "Something wrong?" she asked. "No, just—" He shook his head. "This looks like something Sarah would have made." It was the first time he'd spoken his wife's name aloud in Nora's presence. The words hung in the air, fragile and aching. "Then I hope I did it justice," Nora said quietly. They ate in silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Tommy chattered occasionally, and Nora responded, and gradually, Elias's rigid posture eased. By the end of the meal, he'd cleaned his plate twice, and when Nora offered him a third serving, he actually almost smiled. "You weren't lying about being able to cook," he said. "My mother made sure I learned properly, even if she didn't approve of who I married." Nora began clearing the dishes. "There's also pie. Apple, from your root cellar." This time, Elias did smile, small and brief, but real. "Haven't had pie in 5 years." "Then you're overdue." That night, after Tommy was tucked into bed and the kitchen was clean, Nora sat on the porch and watched the stars emerge. The prairie night was vast and alive with sound, crickets, wind, the distant howling of coyotes. It was nothing like Tulsa, nothing like anywhere she'd ever lived, but there was a strange peace to it. The barn door opened and Elias emerged, silhouetted against the lamplight within. He saw her on the porch and paused, clearly debating whether to approach or retreat. Nora made the decision for him. "Nice night." "Yeah." He climbed the porch steps slowly, like a man approaching a skittish horse. "Boy sleeping?" "Out cold. I think the fresh air exhausted him, in a good way." Elias nodded and leaned against the porch railing, his gaze on the dark horizon. They stood in silence for a while, neither quite comfortable but not uncomfortable either. "Can I ask you something?" Nora finally ventured. "Depends what it is." "Why do you sleep in the barn?" Elias's jaw tightened. "How'd you know that?" "I hear you leave after dinner, and the house is empty except for me and Tommy. Doesn't take much to figure out." "It's my barn. I'll sleep where I want." "I'm not criticizing, just wondering why you'd give up your own house." Elias was quiet for so long that Nora thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Too many ghosts in that house, especially at night. The barn's easier." Nora understood. She'd felt the weight of memory in certain rooms, the sense of absence that was almost a presence. The spare room where she and Tommy slept. It had been meant for a child, she thought. The cradle in the barn confirmed it. A child who'd never been born, or who'd been born but hadn't survived. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "for whatever happened, for whoever you lost. Not your concern. Maybe not, but I'm sorry anyway." Elias pushed off the railing, preparing to retreat again, but then he surprised her by speaking. "Sarah and I were married 3 years. She got pregnant twice. Lost the first at 5 months. The second," his voice went rough. "The second time the baby came early. Lived for 2 days. Sarah held on for another week, but the fever from the birth, doctors couldn't stop it, so I lost them both." Nora's throat closed. "Elias, that was 5 years ago. I'm fine now." The words were clipped, defensive. "Just don't like sleeping in a house that still feels like hers. That's all. The barn suits me fine." He walked away before she could respond, disappearing into the darkness beyond the porch light. Nora sat alone with the weight of his grief, understanding now why he'd helped them, why he'd looked at Tommy's fevered face with such tight-jawed intensity, why he'd given them everything and asked for nothing. He was trying to save them because he hadn't been able to save his own family. Nora closed her eyes and said a prayer, for Elias, for Sarah, for the babies who'd never grown up, and for herself and Tommy, who'd been given an unexpected chance at survival by a man still drowning in old sorrow. The second week brought changes, subtle but real. Tommy began following Elias around the ranch more boldly, his natural child's curiosity overcoming his initial shyness. The rancher didn't encourage it, but he didn't discourage it either. When Tommy asked questions, and 4-year-olds had endless questions, Elias would answer in brief, gruff sentences. "Why are the chickens in a pen?" "Keep the coyotes from eating them." "What's a coyote?" "Wild dog. Mean." "Can I see one?" "No." "Why not?" "Because they're mean, boy. Pay attention." But despite the gruff tone, Nora noticed Elias never sent Tommy away. And once, from the kitchen window, she saw Elias pause in his work to steady Tommy when the boy climbed on a fence rail to get a better look at the horses. Just a hand on the small shoulder, brief and careful, before he moved on. But it was there. The 3 ranch hands appeared midweek, weather-beaten men in their 40s and 50s who worked the cattle in the far pastures and lived in the bunkhouse beyond the barn. They were surprised to find Nora at the house, and even more surprised when Elias introduced her. "Mrs. Gray will be handling the cooking and domestic work. You want meals? You come to the house at mealtimes. Understood?" The men, Hank, Pete, and old Charlie, nodded and murmured their ma'ams with varying degrees of curiosity and approval. Hank, the youngest, had a kind face that crinkled when he smiled at Tommy. Pete was reserved, watching Nora with neutral assessment. Charlie just looked grateful that someone besides Elias would be cooking. "Can't be worse than the boss's attempts," he muttered, and the others chuckled. Elias scowled. "My cooking's fine." "Your cooking's tolerable," Hank corrected, "but I ain't gonna miss it none." That night, Nora cooked for 5 instead of 3, and the men ate with the enthusiasm of people who'd been making do with basic rations for too long. Charlie actually teared up over her cornbread. "Ma'am, you're a blessing," he declared, "a pure blessing." After that, the hands appeared for every meal, and gradually the house felt less empty. There was conversation at the table, work talk mostly, discussion of cattle prices and fence repairs and which pastures needed rotating. Nora listened and learned, piecing together the shape of Elias's operation. He ran about 200 head of cattle, modest by ranch standards, but enough to make a living. The land had been in his family for 2 generations, passed down from his father. He was respected in the area, known as a fair dealer and a hard worker, but also as a man who kept to himself. The hands were loyal, which spoke well of him. Tommy absorbed it all with wide eyes, occasionally piping up with questions that made the men smile, and Elias's mouth twitched toward something almost like amusement. "Mr. Elias, do the cows have names?" "No, boy." "Why not?" "Because there's 200 of them." "I could name them. I'm good at names." "I'm sure you are." "That one could be Bessie, and that one could be—" "Eat your dinner, Tommy," Nora interrupted gently, hiding her smile. As the days passed, Nora fell into a rhythm. Rise before dawn to start breakfast. Feed the chickens while the coffee brewed. Prepare meals, clean the house, tend the garden. Wash clothes in the big copper basin behind the house and hang them in the sun. Mend work shirts with patches on patches. Bake bread every other day, filling the house with yeast and warmth. It was hard work, but it was honest work. And for the first time since James died, Nora felt useful. Felt like she had a purpose beyond simple survival. And every week, Elias left her wages on the kitchen table. More than fair, calculated down to the penny. Nora saved every cent in a small cloth bag hidden in her room, watching it slowly grow. Her nest egg. Her ticket to somewhere else, eventually. The thought of leaving made her chest tight in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. On the 3rd Sunday, the day the hands took off and rode into town, Elias announced he needed to go to town for supplies. "You and the boy can come if you want," he said gruffly over breakfast. "Might be good for you to see the place, meet people." Nora hesitated. Her experiences with small-town people hadn't been positive lately, but Tommy's eyes lit up with excitement, and she couldn't bear to disappoint him. "All right, thank you." The town, Redemption, population maybe 200, was a collection of wooden buildings along a single main street. A general store, a saloon, a church, a blacksmith, a handful of houses. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were immediately noticed. Elias pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and climbed down, then helped Nora and Tommy descend. Several people on the street had stopped to stare, their expressions ranging from curious to disapproving. "Stay close," Elias murmured, his hand briefly touching Nora's elbow. Not possessive, just protective. Inside the store, a thin woman with sharp eyes and a sharper expression stood behind the counter. Her gaze swept over Nora, taking in her worn dress and the child at her side, and her mouth pursed. "Elias," she said coolly, "been a while." "Mrs. Patterson, need to place an order." Elias handed over a list, his tone flat. The woman read the list, her eyebrows climbing. "This is enough food for more than one person." "That's right." "Heard you had someone staying out at your place." Mrs. Patterson's gaze slid to Nora, calculating and cold. "A woman, with a child. Mrs. Gray is my housekeeper," Elias said, his voice taking on an edge. "She's working for wages, same as my hands. If that's a problem for you, I can take my business to Miller's place in the next town." Mrs. Patterson's expression soured, but she nodded. "No problem at all, just making conversation." But as Nora browsed the store with Tommy, she felt eyes on her back, heard the whispers starting even before they left. "That's her, the widow woman. Showed up out of nowhere, I heard, half dead." "Convenient, isn't it? Man like Elias Ward, all alone, and a pretty woman just happens to need help." "You think he's—" "What else would she be doing there? And that boy, whose is he really?" Nora's face burned, but she kept her head high. She'd endured worse. She could endure this. Elias appeared at her elbow, his expression thunderous. "Got what we need. Let's go." Outside, a small crowd had gathered, women mostly, clustered near the church steps, watching with barely concealed judgment. One of them, an older woman with gray hair and a face like a dried apple, called out, "Elias Ward, you bringing women of ill repute into our town now?" Elias stopped cold. Nora grabbed his arm, feeling the tension coiled in his muscles. "Don't," she whispered. "It'll only make it worse." But Elias shook her off gently and turned to face the women. When he spoke, his voice carried across the street, cold and hard as iron. "Mrs. Crowley, Mrs. Patterson, ladies, Mrs. Gray is a widow who needed work. I hired her. She lives in my house, yes, but under my roof, she and her son are under my protection. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me directly. But I'd advise against spreading gossip about a woman who's done nothing wrong except survive circumstances beyond her control. We clear?" The women shifted uncomfortably, but Mrs. Crowley wasn't finished. "It's not proper, Elias, a single woman living with a single man. People will talk." "People always talk," Elias said flatly. "Let them. Mrs. Gray is staying. End of discussion." He turned his back on them, a deliberate dismissal, and helped Nora and Tommy into the wagon. As they pulled away, Nora looked back to see the women still clustered together, their mouths moving with furious speculation. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause you trouble." "You didn't cause anything," Elias replied, his hands tight on the reins. "Small-minded people cause their own trouble. Don't worry about them." But Nora did worry. She worried that the gossip would damage Elias's reputation, make it harder for him to do business. She worried that Tommy would hear the cruel words and understand what they meant. She worried that eventually Elias would decide they weren't worth the trouble. Tommy, oblivious to the tension, chattered happily about the things he'd seen in town. Elias let the boy's voice fill the silence, not contributing but not stopping him either. When they arrived back at the ranch, Nora climbed down from the wagon and turned to Elias. "Thank you for defending us. You didn't have to do that." "Yeah, I did." His dark eyes met hers, steady and sure. "You're under my roof. That makes you my responsibility. Anyone wants to come at you, they go through me first." Something shifted in Nora's chest at those words. A feeling she couldn't quite name, warm and unsettling and dangerously close to hope. "Still," she said. "Thank you." Elias nodded once, then began unloading supplies, the moment over. But as Nora took Tommy inside and began putting away groceries, she couldn't shake the memory of Elias standing between her and those judgmental women, his voice hard with protective anger. No one had stood up for her in months, not since James died. And even James, as much as she'd loved him, had been gentle and yielding, preferring to avoid conflict rather than confront it. Elias Ward was not gentle, was not yielding. He was granite and resolve, and he'd just made it clear that while Nora was here, she was his to protect. It should have felt presumptuous. Instead, it felt like safety. That night, after Tommy was asleep and the house was quiet, Nora found Elias on the porch again. It was becoming habit, these late evening conversations that weren't quite conversations. Just two people sharing space and silence, sometimes words. "The women in town," Nora said without preamble, "what they're saying about me, about us, it's not going to stop." "Probably not." "It might affect your business, your reputation." "Might." "Elias, I'm serious. If my being here causes you problems—" "Nora." He turned to look at her fully, his expression shadowed in the lamplight. "I don't care what those women think. Haven't cared what anyone thinks for 5 years now. You're here because you needed help and I could give it. You're staying because you work hard and you're good at what you do. That's all that matters. But no buts. You want to leave, that's your choice. But don't leave because of gossip. Life's too short to live by other people's judgments." Nora studied him, this hard, closed-off man who'd somehow become her protector. "When did you stop caring what people thought?" "When Sarah died." His voice was matter-of-fact. "Whole town came to the funeral, brought food, said pretty words. But when I needed help, real help, someone to talk to, someone to help me figure out how to keep living, they disappeared. Decided I wanted to be left alone, so they left me alone. After a while, I realized I preferred it that way." "That's lonely." "Lonely's safe." Nora understood that, had felt it herself. But she also knew that safety could become its own kind of prison. "Thank you anyway," she said softly, "for standing up for us. Whether you care about their opinions or not, it mattered to me." Elias nodded, then pushed off the railing. "Better get some sleep. Early day tomorrow." But before he could leave, Tommy's voice called from inside. "Mama?" Nora hurried in to find her son sitting up in bed, his small face creased with worry. "What is it, baby?" "I had a bad dream. About the walking, about being hot and thirsty." "Oh, sweetheart." Nora gathered him close. "That's all over now. We're safe here." "But what if we have to leave? What if we have to walk again?" "We won't. Mrs. Gray's right." Elias's voice came from the doorway, startling them both. He stood there, hat in hand, his expression softer than Nora had ever seen it. "You're not walking anywhere, boy. Not unless you want to. This is your home for as long as you need it." Tommy blinked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "Promise?" Elias hesitated, and Nora saw the war play across his face, the instinct to keep distance fighting against something deeper. Then he stepped into the room and knelt beside the bed, bringing himself down to Tommy's level. "I promise," he said quietly. "Your mama works for me, which means you both stay here. Safe. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Tommy's whole body relaxed. Then, hesitantly, "Mr. Elias, can you tell me a story? Mama's stories are good, but I bet you know different ones." "Tommy, Mr. Ward doesn't have time," Nora began. "Actually," Elias interrupted, surprising them both, "I might know one. About a horse named Thunder. If you want to hear it." Tommy nodded eagerly, snuggling back under the covers. Elias sat on the edge of the bed, and in his rough, unpracticed voice, told a simple story about a wild stallion who learned to trust a rancher. It wasn't polished or fancy, but Tommy hung on every word, his eyelids growing heavier as the tale progressed. By the end, the boy was asleep, one small hand curled near his face. Elias stood carefully, not wanting to wake him. "You're good with him," Nora whispered. "Natural." "Had practice," Elias said quietly. "Or thought I would. Before, He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. The ghost of the son he'd never gotten to raise hung in the air between them." "He likes you," Nora offered. "Tommy, he feels safe with you." "Kid's too trusting. Or maybe he's a better judge of character than you give him credit for." Elias met her eyes in the dim lamplight, and for a moment something passed between them. Understanding, connection, the beginning of something neither was quite ready to name. Then he cleared his throat and stepped back. "Good night, Nora." "Good night, Elias." He left, his footsteps fading down the stairs and out into the night. Nora sat beside her sleeping son and felt the walls around her heart, walls she'd built after James died, walls designed to protect her from more pain, begin to crack just slightly. This ranch, this strange arrangement, this guarded man who showed kindness through actions instead of words, it was all temporary. She knew that. She was saving money, and eventually she and Tommy would move on to somewhere more permanent, somewhere that was really theirs. But as Nora climbed into her own bed and listened to the prairie wind whisper against the windows, she couldn't help wondering what it would be like if they stayed. If this home, this life, this man could somehow become theirs for real. It was a dangerous thought. But in the darkness, alone with her hopes and fears, Nora let herself think it anyway. Just this once. The dangerous thought became dangerous reality on a Tuesday evening in late September, when everything changed. The day had started ordinarily enough. Nora woke before dawn as usual, started breakfast, watched the sky lighten from black to gray to pale gold. Tommy helped her gather eggs, chattering about the wooden horse Elias had been carving for him in the evenings. Small gestures of connection that the rancher would never acknowledge as affection, but were exactly that. The hands came in for breakfast, hungry and good-natured. Elias ate in his usual silence, but Nora had learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the almost imperceptible softening around his eyes when Tommy asked him questions. He was thawing, slowly, like frozen ground under a patient sun. After the men left for their work, Nora tackled the week's baking. 6 loaves of bread, 2 pies, biscuits for the next few days. the kitchen filled with warmth and the yeasty smell of rising dough. Tommy played on the floor with wooden blocks Hank had made for him, building and destroying elaborate structures with 4-year-old enthusiasm. It was peaceful, domestic, almost perfect. Then, around mid-afternoon, a horse appeared on the road. Nora saw it from the kitchen window, a single rider, moving at a deliberate pace. Not the casual approach of a neighbor or the hurried gait of someone with urgent business. Something about it made her uneasy, though she couldn't say why. She wiped flour from her hands and stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the sun. The rider was a man, she could tell now, wearing city clothes that looked out of place against the prairie backdrop. As he drew closer, something about his build, his posture, sent ice through her veins. No, it couldn't be. But it was. Vincent Gray, James's older brother, rode into the yard with the self-assured bearing of a man who believed the world owed him respect. He was handsome in a sharp, calculated way, dark hair slicked back, expensive suit despite the dust of travel, a smile that never reached his eyes. Nora had met him exactly 3 times. At her wedding, where he'd made it clear he thought James was marrying beneath him, at James's funeral, where he'd offered no comfort but plenty of judgment, and once before that, at a family gathering where his eyes had lingered on her in a way that made her skin crawl. She hadn't seen or heard from him in 7 months, had hoped she never would again. Vincent, Nora's voice came out steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. What are you doing here? He dismounted with practiced ease and tied his horse to the porch rail, taking his time, making her wait. When he finally looked at her, his smile was all teeth and no warmth. Nora, my dear sister-in-law, I've been looking for you everywhere. His gaze swept over the ranch, assessing, calculating. Interesting place you've landed. Very interesting indeed. I work here, as a housekeeper. She kept her chin up, her hands clasped to hide their trembling. It's honest work. Oh, I'm sure it is. Vincent's tone suggested he believed exactly the opposite. And the man who owns this place, where might he be? Working. What do you want, Vincent? He climbed the porch steps, and Nora had to force herself not to retreat. Vincent had never physically harmed her, but there was a threat in him that went beyond violence, a cold certainty that he would take what he wanted, one way or another. I want what's mine, he said simply. The boy. Thomas. The world tilted. What? My nephew. James's son. He belongs with family, not here in the middle of nowhere with a mother who can't provide for him. Vincent's voice was reasonable, almost kind, which made it worse. I've come to take him back to Tulsa. I can give him a proper home, proper education, opportunities you never could. It's what James would have wanted. You have no right. I have every right. I'm his blood uncle, his guardian by law now that his father is dead. You, on the other hand, are a destitute widow living in sin with a strange man. Oh yes, I heard about your arrangement here. The whole territory's talking about it. What judge would grant you custody over a respectable, financially secure family member? Nora's vision blurred. Tommy is my son, mine. You can't just... I can, and I will. Vincent pulled a folded paper from his jacket. I have a lawyer's letter right here, outlining my claim. Now, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Easy way, you pack the boy's things, what few things he has, and I take him with me today. Hard way, I involve the law, drag this through the courts, and you lose him anyway while destroying whatever shred of reputation you have left. Your choice. Inside the house, Tommy called out, Mama, who's that? Vincent's eyes lit up. There's my nephew, Thomas. Come say hello to your Uncle Vincent. Stay inside, Tommy, Nora called back, her voice sharp with panic. She turned back to Vincent, desperate. Please, please don't do this. He's all I have. He's everything. I'll do anything. Anything? Vincent's smile turned predatory. Well now, that's quite an offer. What exactly did you have in mind? The implication was clear and vile. Nora's stomach turned, but before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. You've got about 5 seconds to get off my property before I remove you myself. Elias stood at the edge of the yard, having approached unseen during the confrontation. His hat shadowed his face, but his posture radiated barely contained violence. In his hand, held loosely but unmistakably ready, was a rifle. Vincent turned, assessing this new element. And you must be the famous Elias Ward, the man generous enough to take in my poor sister-in-law in her time of need. How charitable of you. But didn't ask who you were, asked you to leave. I'm Vincent Gray, James Gray's brother. I've come for my nephew. The boy has a mother. He stays with her. Vincent's smile never wavered. The boy has an uncle who can provide for him properly. Mrs. Gray, as you can see, is in no position to raise a child. Living here, under your roof, with no husband, no prospects, it's hardly appropriate. I'm sure you understand. What I understand is you're making threats on my land. Elias moved closer, and something in his movement made Vincent actually take a step back. Don't much care for that. I have legal standing. Don't care about that either. Elias climbed the porch steps, positioning himself between Vincent and Nora. What I care about is that woman there is under my protection. So's her boy. And nobody, lawyer or no lawyer, family or not, takes them from this ranch unless she agrees to it, which, from the sound of things, she doesn't. Vincent's expression hardened. This isn't your concern, Mr. Ward. Made it my concern the day I hired her. Made it more my concern when you showed up here threatening her. So here's how this is going to go. You're going to get on your fancy horse, ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of, and forget you ever had a nephew. Because if you try to take that boy, you'll answer to me. And trust me, you don't want that. You're making a mistake, Vincent said coldly. I have resources, connections. I can make your life very difficult. Can you now? Elias's tone was almost conversational. Well, I've got 300 acres, a rifle, and no patience for city men who think they can come out here and push people around. Reckon we'll see whose resources matter more. For a long moment, the men stared at each other. Vincent's confidence had cracked just slightly, but there was something else in his eyes now, calculation. He was reassessing, planning his next move. Fine, he said finally. I'll leave. For now. But this isn't over, Nora. That boy is a Gray, and Grays take care of their own. I'll be back with the law, and when I am, your ranch hand here won't be able to help you. He spat the words ranch hand like an insult, the implication clear. Elias's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. You know where the road is. Vincent mounted his horse, but before he rode off, he looked directly at Nora. Think about what's best for Thomas, Nora. Think about what James would have wanted. I'll give you 1 week to come to your senses. After that, I'm filing papers with the territorial court. He wheeled his horse and rode off at a gallop, leaving dust and dread in his wake. Nora's legs gave out. She caught herself on the porch railing, but Elias was there, his hand steady under her elbow, holding her up. Easy now. He's gone. For now, Nora whispered. But he'll be back. He meant it, Elias. He'll take Tommy. He'll use the law, use my reputation, use everything against me, and I don't have the money for a lawyer. I don't have any way to fight him, and he's right, isn't he? A judge will look at me, a widow, working as a housekeeper, living here with you, and they'll give Tommy to Vincent because he has money and respectability, and I have nothing. Stop. Elias's voice was firm. Breathe. You're spiraling. Nora tried, but panic had its claws in her. You don't understand. Vincent isn't a good man. He doesn't want Tommy out of love or duty. He wants him because James inherited some money from their parents, and Tommy is James's heir. Vincent thinks if he has custody of Tommy, he can control that inheritance until Tommy comes of age. He'll put my son in some boarding school and drain every penny James left behind, and Tommy will grow up thinking his mother abandoned him. Then we won't let that happen. How? Nora's voice broke. How do we stop him? You heard him. He has lawyers, connections, the law on his side. And what do I have? A job that barely pays enough to save for rent somewhere else, let alone court fees. A reputation that's been dragged through the mud by town gossip. No husband, no family willing to help. What defense do I possibly have? Elias was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon where Vincent had disappeared. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, as if he were testing each word before releasing it. You could have a husband. Nora's head snapped up. What? A husband changes everything. Judge looks at a married couple running a successful ranch versus a bachelor uncle who's never shown interest in the boy until now. Custody goes to the parents. Simple as that. But I'm not married. James is dead, and I'm not... Realization hit her like cold water. Wait, are you suggesting... Practical solution, Elias interrupted, his tone flat, businesslike. You need a home. I need an heir. We can save each other. The words hung between them, stark and stunning. Nora stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. Marriage, not romance, not love, just a transaction, a business arrangement to solve both their problems. You can't be serious. Completely serious. Elias finally looked at her, and his expression was unreadable. I'm 42 years old, been alone for 5 years, figured I'd stay that way until I died. But the fact is, this ranch needs someone to pass to when I'm gone. Don't have children, won't have children. His voice caught almost imperceptibly on that word. But your boy, he could inherit, could learn the business, take it over eventually, and you'd have security, protection, a legal standing that no city lawyer could challenge. This is insane, Nora whispered. You can't just marry someone as a business transaction. Why not? People do it all the time, and arranged marriages, marriages of convenience. This isn't any different. We both get what we need, and nobody gets hurt. But, Nora's mind raced, but that's not fair to you. You'd be tied to a woman you barely know, taking on responsibility for a child who isn't yours, all to help us fight Vincent. Why would you do that? Elias's jaw worked, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then quietly, because I know what it's like to lose a child, and I won't stand by and watch you lose yours. Not if I can prevent it. Tears burned Nora's eyes. Elias, don't. He held up a hand. Don't make it more than it is. This is practical, strategic. You need help, and this is help I can give. That's all. But it wasn't all, and they both knew it. This was a man who'd held himself apart for 5 years, who'd built walls so high nothing could reach him, offering to tear those walls down for people he'd known only a few weeks. It was monumental and terrifying and impossibly generous. I can't ask you to sacrifice yourself for us, Nora said softly. You're not asking. I'm offering. There's a difference. But marriage it's permanent. If you're doing this just to help me, you'd be trapped. Nora. Elias's voice was gentle for the first time since she'd known him. I've been trapped in grief for 5 years. This isn't trap. This is purpose. Something to build instead of something to mourn. If you can live with that, then we have a deal. Inside the house, Tommy called again, his voice tinged with worry. Mama, is everything okay? Nora looked toward the door, toward her son, the center of her universe. Then back to Elias, this hard, broken man who was offering her salvation in the most unexpected way possible. I need to think about this, she said finally. It's not a decision I can make in 5 minutes. Fair enough, but Vincent gave you a week. After that, he's coming back with lawyers and court orders, so think fast. He walked away back toward the barn, leaving Nora alone with the weight of an impossible choice. The next 3 days were agony. Nora moved through her tasks in a daze, her mind spinning with possibilities and consequences. Marriage to Elias would solve the immediate problem. Vincent couldn't claim Tommy if she had a husband, especially not one with Elias's standing in the community. The ranch hands respected him. He owned his land outright. He was exactly the kind of stable, respectable man a judge would favor. But marriage wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a lifetime commitment, and Nora had already lived that once with James. The difference was, she'd loved James, had chosen him freely, had built a life with him based on affection and partnership and hope for the future. What Elias was offering wasn't that. It was protection and practicality, security without sentiment. Could she live like that? Could she share a home, a life, a name with a man she didn't love and who didn't love her? More importantly, was it fair to Elias? He'd already lost so much. Did he really understand what he was offering to give up? The possibility of finding real love again, of having a family that was truly his? The questions haunted her through bread making and clothes washing and all the mundane tasks that suddenly felt weighted with significance. Every time she saw Elias, at meals, passing in the yard, Once, when Tommy dragged him over to see a particularly interesting caterpillar, she searched his face for doubt, for second thoughts. But his expression remained closed, unreadable, giving nothing away. On the third night, Nora found Hank alone in the barn, mending a broken harness by lantern light. The old cowhand looked up when she entered, his weathered face crinkling into a smile. "Evening, ma'am. Something I can do for you?" "Actually, I was hoping to ask you something about Elias." Hank's smile faded into something more cautious. "What about him? Has he always been so closed off, so alone?" The old man was quiet for a moment, working leather through his calloused hands. Then, "Not always, no. When Miss Sarah was alive, he was different. Not exactly cheerful, mind you. Elias was always on the serious side, but he'd smile. Laugh, even. Had plans for the ranch, for their future together. Then she died, and the baby with her, and it's like something in him just shut down. Been 5 years, and he still sleeps out here instead of in the house. Still keeps her picture on the dresser but doesn't look at it. Still sets aside money in an account he won't touch because it was supposed to be for the child's education." Nora's throat tightened. "He told me about what happened." "Did he now?" Hank looked surprised. "That's something. Boss doesn't talk about it. Not to anyone. Fact that he told you means he trusts you, ma'am. That's rare." "Hank, if someone wanted to help him, to give him a reason to live beyond just existing, do you think he'd accept it, or would he push them away?" The old cowhand studied her for a long moment, his eyes knowing. "Depends on how it was offered, I reckon. Elias don't like charity, don't like people feeling sorry for him. But if it was practical, mutually beneficial, something that served a purpose beyond just making him feel better, then yeah, I think he might accept it. Might even welcome it, down deep, though he'd never say so. Even if it meant letting someone close again, risking getting hurt? Ma'am, begging your pardon, but a man like Elias, he's already about as hurt as a person can get. Question isn't whether he'll risk getting hurt. Question is whether he's willing to risk feeling alive again." Nora left the barn with more to think about than ever. But Hank's words stayed with her, willing to risk feeling alive again. Was that what she'd be offering Elias? Not just a solution to her problem, but a chance for him to step back into the world of the living? And what about her own heart? Could she marry for practicality and protection, knowing she might never feel for Elias what she'd felt for James? Or worse, could she handle it if she did develop feelings for a man who'd made it clear this was purely transactional? On the fourth day, Tommy solved the dilemma in the way only a child could, with perfect, innocent clarity. He'd been following Elias around all morning, helping with chores in the way 4-year-olds help, which mostly meant getting in the way and asking constant questions. But Elias tolerated it with what Nora now recognized as his version of patience. At lunch, Tommy climbed into the chair next to Elias instead of his usual spot beside Nora. "Mr. Elias, can I ask you something?" "Suppose so." "Are you going to be my pa now?" The room went silent. Every hand stopped eating. Nora froze with a spoonful of soup halfway to her mouth. Elias stared at the boy with something like panic in his eyes. "What makes you think that, son?" "'Cause you take care of us. And you live here with us. And you carved me a horse. And you told me a story when I had bad dreams. That's what pasts do, right? So I thought maybe you were going to be mine." Nora found her voice. "Tommy, sweetheart, Mr. Ward is just being kind. He's not—" "Would you want that?" Elias interrupted, his eyes still locked on Tommy's face. "A pa like me?" Tommy nodded vigorously. "You're strong, and you know everything about horses and cows, and you don't get mad when I ask questions, and you make Mama smile sometimes even though she tries to hide it. So yeah, I'd like that lots." Elias's expression cracked, just for a moment, showing something raw and aching underneath. Then he composed himself and looked across the table at Nora. "Reckon that settles it then," he said quietly. "If you'll have me." It wasn't a proper proposal. There was no romance in it, no flowery words or bended knee, just a practical question from a practical man, witnessed by a table full of cowboys and one oblivious 4-year-old who'd just accidentally orchestrated the whole thing. But somehow, it was perfect. "Yes," Nora heard herself say. "Yes, I'll marry you." Tommy cheered. The hands broke into startled grins and congratulations, and Elias just nodded once, sharp and final, as if they'd just agreed on a livestock purchase rather than a lifetime commitment. "I'll ride to town this afternoon," he said. "Talk to Pastor Reynolds about a ceremony. Sooner we make it legal, sooner Vincent's claim loses standing. That work for you?" "That works fine," Nora managed, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear herself think. "Good. Then it's settled." He stood, placed his hat back on his head, and walked out, leaving Nora alone with her decision and the sudden, terrifying realization that in less than a week, she'd be Mrs. Elias Ward. Not out of love, out of necessity. But as Tommy climbed into her lap and hugged her tight, whispering, "We get to stay, Mama. We really get to stay," Nora thought that maybe necessity was enough. Maybe love could come later, or never, and they'd still be okay. She had to believe that, because she'd just agreed to marry a man who still loved a ghost, and there was no going back now. That evening, after the hands had left and Tommy was in bed, Elias called Nora out to the porch. He held something in his hands, a small box worn with age. "This was my mother's," he said without preamble, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a small garnet stone. "She gave it to Sarah. After Sarah died, I put it away. Figured I'd never need it again." He held it out to Nora. "It's yours now, if you want it." Nora stared at the ring, her throat tight. "Elias, I can't take Sarah's ring. It wouldn't be right." "Sarah's gone. You're here. And we need this to look real if we're going to convince a judge Vincent has no claim. So take it. Make it yours." Slowly, Nora reached out and accepted the box. The ring was beautiful in its simplicity, the garnet catching the lamplight like a drop of blood. "Thank you," she whispered. "Pastor Reynolds will do the ceremony day after tomorrow," Elias continued, his tone businesslike. "I told him it was sudden, but he's known me long enough not to ask questions. We'll need a witness. I'll ask Miss Maybelle from the neighboring farm. She's discreet." "Day after tomorrow," Nora repeated, letting the reality sink in. "That's fast. Vincent gave us a week. Better to be ahead of schedule than behind." "Right. Of course." Nora turned the ring box over in her hands. "Elias, I need to know, what happens after? After we're married, what does that look like? Do you expect, will we—" She couldn't finish, couldn't make herself ask about the intimate realities of marriage to a man she barely knew, but Elias understood. "This is a marriage on paper, Nora, for protection and practicality. I'm not expecting anything beyond that. You'll keep your room, I'll keep the barn, we'll live like we've been living, just with legal standing. That clear enough?" Relief and something that might have been disappointment warred in Nora's chest. "Very clear, thank you." "Don't thank me. This helps me as much as you. Boy needs a father, ranch needs an heir. We're solving problems, that's all." But it wasn't all, no matter how many times he said it. No man married a virtual stranger just to solve problems. There was something more driving Elias's offer, something he wouldn't or couldn't articulate. Nora could see it in the way he looked at Tommy, the way his expression softened when he thought no one was watching, the way he'd stepped between her and Vincent without a moment's hesitation. He cared. He just didn't know how to admit it. "Still," Nora said softly, "thank you for caring enough to do this, even if you won't call it that." Elias's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Didn't confirm it either, just nodded and walked away, leaving Nora alone with a dead woman's ring and the weight of a marriage built on everything but love. The day of the wedding dawned gray and cool, autumn asserting itself after weeks of lingering summer heat. Nora woke early, her stomach in knots, and dressed in her only good dress, a simple gray cotton that had seen better days but was at least clean and mended. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the woman staring back. When she'd married James, she'd been 19 and full of dreams, wearing a white dress her mother had sewn, her hair arranged with real orange blossoms. She'd believed in fairy tales then, in happily ever after, in love conquering all. Now she was 27 and worn down by life, wearing faded gray, about to marry a man who'd made it clear he expected nothing from her beyond her presence. No fairy tale? No happily ever after, just survival, dressed up in legal paperwork. "Mama!" Tommy appeared in the doorway, already dressed in the new clothes Elias had bought him, proper trousers and a button-up shirt. You look pretty. Thank you, baby. Nora forced a smile. You look very handsome. Are you scared? The question caught her off guard. What makes you think I'm scared? You're making that face, the one you made when we were walking and you didn't know where we were going, but you pretended you did. Nora's smile became real despite herself. Her son, so observant, so wise beyond his years. She knelt down and pulled him into a hug. Maybe a little scared, she admitted, but it's going to be okay. Mr. Ward is a good man, and this means we get to stay here, safe, together. That's what matters. And he'll be my pa for real? Yes, for real. Good. Tommy hugged her tighter. 'Cause I like him. He's quiet, but he listens when I talk. And he doesn't get angry like Uncle Vincent does. The mention of Vincent sent a chill through Nora. They were doing this because of him, because of the threat he represented. In a way, Vincent had forced this marriage as surely as if he'd held a gun to their heads. But Nora pushed the thought away. This was her choice, hers and Elias's. Vincent didn't get to taint it. The ceremony was held in the kitchen, of all places, with Miss Maybelle from the neighboring farm and the 3 ranch hands as witnesses. Pastor Reynolds, a kind-faced man in his 60s, had agreed to perform the service despite the unusual circumstances. Elias stood by the window, dressed in what was clearly his only suit, dark wool, slightly worn at the elbows but clean and pressed. He'd shaved and combed his hair back, and the effort he'd made, small as it was, touched something in Nora's chest. He looked up when she entered, and for just a moment something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or appreciation. Then it was gone, locked away behind his usual guardedness. "Ready?" he asked simply. "Ready." They stood side by side in front of Pastor Reynolds, and the old preacher began the familiar words. "Dearly beloved, gathered here, holy matrimony." The phrases washed over Nora like water, surreal and distant. This was happening. She was really doing this. "Do you, Elias Ward, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do." Elias's voice was steady, certain. "And do you, Nora Gray, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Nora opened her mouth. This was the moment, the point of no return. She could still say no, could still grab Tommy and run, could take her chances with Vincent and the courts, and hope for the best. But Tommy stood beside her, his small hand gripping her skirt, his eyes bright with hope and trust. And Elias stood waiting, this hard, lonely man who'd offered her everything and asked for nothing. "I do," Nora said. Pastor Reynolds smiled. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Oklahoma, I pronounce you husband and wife. Elias, you may kiss your bride." The room went silent. Nora's eyes met Elias's, and she saw her own panic reflected there. They hadn't discussed this part, hadn't prepared for it. But Miss Maybelle was watching with misty eyes, and the pastor was waiting, and they needed this to look real. Elias leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. Nora didn't move. His lips brushed hers, barely a touch, over almost before it began, chaste and brief, and nothing like a real wedding kiss. But Nora's heart hammered anyway, and when Elias pulled back, something in his expression had shifted, just slightly, just enough. "Congratulations," Pastor Reynolds said warmly, breaking the moment. "May your marriage be blessed with peace and prosperity." The hands cheered. Miss Maybelle dabbed at her eyes. Tommy whooped and threw his arms around both of them at once, creating an awkward 3-way embrace that made everyone laugh. And just like that, it was done. Nora Gray was now Nora Ward, and there was no going back. The celebration, such as it was, consisted of a simple lunch Miss Maybelle had prepared. Cold chicken, fresh bread, and a cake that was slightly lopsided but tasted like heaven. They ate on the porch, the autumn air crisp and clean, and for a little while, it almost felt like a real wedding, like they were a real family, gathering to celebrate a real union. But as the afternoon wore on and the guests departed, reality settled back in. This wasn't a real marriage. It was a legal maneuver. And now they had to figure out how to live with that. That evening, after Tommy was asleep and the house was quiet, Nora sat alone in what was now legally her home, wearing a ring that had belonged to two women before her, married to a man she barely knew. She heard Elias's footsteps on the porch. He was preparing to retreat to the barn, as always. But before he could leave, Nora opened the door. "Elias, wait." He turned, his expression wary. "Something wrong?" "No, I wanted to say that I'll try my best to make this work. To be a good wife, even if it's not a traditional marriage. You've given me and Tommy so much. I want you to know I won't take that for granted." Elias studied her for a long moment. Then, quietly, "I don't think you're broken, Nora, and I'd learn to love right if you let me." The words hung in the air, vulnerable and unexpected. Before Nora could respond, before she could process what he'd just admitted, a voice called out from the road, "Well, well, isn't this touching?" Vincent Gray rode into the yard, and he wasn't alone. Behind him were two men, one wearing a badge, the other in a suit that screamed lawyer. "Hope I'm not interrupting the happy couple," Vincent said with false cheer. "But I told you I'd be back. This is Marshal Cooper and Mr. Thornton, my attorney. We've come to serve papers regarding custody of Thomas Gray. Or should I say, Thomas Ward now. Heard about your hasty little wedding. Very convenient timing." The marshal dismounted, looking uncomfortable. "Ma'am, sir, I'm sorry about this, but Mr. Gray has filed a petition with the territorial court. I need to serve you these papers and inform you of a custody hearing scheduled for 2 weeks from now." He held out an official-looking document. Elias took it, his expression carved from stone. "This legal?" he asked the marshal. "Yes, sir. Mr. Gray is the boy's blood uncle and has standing to petition for custody. The judge will hear both sides and make a determination." Vincent's smile was triumphant. "You see, Nora, your little marriage doesn't change anything. I'm still family. I still have rights. And when I tell the judge about your circumstances, how you stumbled onto this ranch destitute and desperate, how you've been living here unmarried for weeks, how you suddenly married the rancher right before I filed papers, well, it's going to look exactly like what it is, a desperate ploy by a woman of questionable character. You son of a—" Elias started forward, but Nora grabbed his arm. "Don't. That's what he wants." "Smart girl," Vincent said. "For once. See you in court, sister-in-law. Oh, and Elias, I hope your ranch hand wages were worth becoming part of this mess, because when I win, and I will win, you're going to wish you'd stayed out of it." He wheeled his horse and rode off, the lawyer following. The marshal lingered, looking apologetic. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I hope you folks work this out. Boy looked happy here from what I could see. But the law's the law. You'll need to appear at the courthouse in 2 weeks. Bring whatever documentation you can. Marriage certificate, proof of income, character witnesses. It'll help your case." He tipped his hat and left, leaving Elias and Nora standing in the yard, the custody papers heavy in Elias's hand. "He knew," Nora whispered. "Somehow he knew we'd get married, and he waited just long enough to make it look suspicious. He played us. Maybe. But we're not beat yet." Elias's voice was hard, determined. "We've got 2 weeks to build a case, to show we're a real family, not some hastily arranged fraud. And we will. Because I'll be damned if I let that man take your son." Nora looked at her husband, and saw something burning in his eyes. Not just determination, not just protective instinct, something deeper, something that looked almost like the love he'd claimed he could learn. "He's hers," Elias had said to Vincent weeks ago, "and he's mine by choice." Now they'd have to prove it, in a courtroom, in front of a judge, with Vincent doing everything in his power to tear them apart. But as Elias's hand found hers in the darkness, his grip strong and steady, Nora allowed herself to believe they might actually win. They had to. Because the alternative, losing Tommy, losing this fragile family they'd built, was unthinkable. The battle was just beginning. The 2 weeks before the hearing passed in a blur of preparation and growing tension. Elias threw himself into building their case with the same methodical focus he brought to everything. He rode into town the day after the papers were served and returned with a lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Hale, who'd built her reputation defending homesteaders against land companies. She wasn't cheap, but Elias paid her retainer without hesitation, drawing from savings he'd kept untouched for years. "Tell me everything," Margaret said that first evening, sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread before her. "Every detail of how Mrs. Ward came to be here, your marriage, the boy's condition, Vincent Gray's character. Everything." So they told her. Nora recounted the desperate walk across Oklahoma, Tommy's illness, Elias's intervention. Elias explained the practical arrangement, his need for an heir, the mutual benefit. Margaret listened without judgment, taking notes in quick, precise handwriting. "The timing looks bad," she said finally. "I won't sugarcoat that. Vincent's lawyer will paint this as a fraudulent marriage designed solely to block his custody claim. We need to prove otherwise." "How?" Nora asked, her stomach nodding. "By showing you're a real family. That means documented evidence of cohabitation, joint decisions, shared responsibility for the child. Character witnesses who can testify to your fitness as parents. Financial stability. That works in your favor, Mr. Ward. The ranch is successful and debt-free. But we also need to undermine Vincent's claim that he's acting in the child's best interest." "He's not," Nora said flatly. "He wants control of Tommy's inheritance. James left money for his son's future, and Vincent thinks if he has custody, he can access it." Margaret's expression sharpened. "Can you prove that?" "No, but I know my brother-in-law. He's never shown interest in Tommy before. Never visited, never sent money after James died, never offered help when we were starving on the streets. Now suddenly he wants custody. It's about the money. It has to be. Knowing and proving are different things. But I'll dig into his finances, see if there's evidence of debt or gambling or anything that might suggest financial motivation." Margaret closed her notebook. "In the meantime, you two need to look like a married couple. That means appearing together publicly, being seen as a unit. No more sleeping in the barn, Mr. Ward." Elias's jaw tightened. "That's not—" "We agreed." "I don't care what you agreed. A judge who hears the husband sleeps in the barn will question the legitimacy of this marriage instantly. You need to share a bedroom, or at least appear to. Can you manage that?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Nora's face burned, but she forced herself to meet Elias's eyes. "We can manage," she said quietly. "If it helps Tommy, we can manage anything." Elias nodded stiffly. "Fine. I'll move my things to the house." After Margaret left, promising to return with more questions and strategy, Nora and Elias stood in the kitchen, avoiding each other's gaze. "I'll take the spare room," Elias said finally. "The one next to yours and Tommy's. Door stays open during the day, so if anyone comes by, they see my things there." "That work?" "That works." Nora's relief was palpable. "Thank you for understanding." "This was always about practicality, Nora. Nothing's changed." But everything had changed, and they both knew it. The marriage that was supposed to be a simple legal arrangement had become a performance, and now they'd have to convince not just a judge, but an entire town that what they had was real. The next morning, Elias moved his belongings from the barn loft to the spare room, a process that took all of 10 minutes since he owned so little. A change of clothes, some books, his shaving kit, the accumulated possessions of a man who'd stopped caring about comfort years ago. Nora helped him make up the bed with fresh linens, hyper-aware of the intimacy of the task. Making a bed for your husband, such a simple, domestic thing. But with Elias, everything felt weighted with significance. "You don't have many things," she observed, smoothing the quilt. "Don't need much. Everyone needs something, something that brings them joy or comfort or, had those things once, didn't do much good when I lost them." Nora paused, her hand stilling on the fabric. "Elias, can I ask you something?" He tensed, clearly expecting a difficult question. "Go ahead." "Why did you really offer to marry me? And don't say it was just practical. I know you well enough now to know there's more to it than that." For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. He stood at the window looking out at the prairie, his shoulders rigid. "You ever lose something so completely that you convince yourself you'll never want it again?" he said finally. "That wanting is just setting yourself up for more pain, so better not to want it all?" "Yes," Nora whispered, thinking of James, of the life they'd planned that ended in 3 days of fever and delirium. "That's where I've been for 5 years. Not wanting, not hoping, just existing." Elias turned to face her, and his expression was raw in a way she'd never seen. "Then you showed up with your boy. half dead and desperate, and something in me, something I thought was gone, woke up. Couldn't let you die, couldn't let you leave, couldn't stand the thought of you and Tommy out there alone with no protection. So I told myself it was practical, mutual benefit, an arrangement. But it wasn't, Nora said softly. No, it wasn't. His voice was rough. I care about you, both of you. Don't know when it happened or how, but I do. And if we lose this case, if Vincent takes Tommy, it'll break you. And watching you break will break me. So yeah, this marriage is practical, but it's also more. The confession hung between them, vulnerable and terrifying. Nora's heart pounded against her ribs, a storm of emotion she couldn't name rising in her chest. I care about you too, she admitted. I didn't want to, didn't plan to. But you've been kind when you didn't have to be. Patient with Tommy. Protective of us both. That matters, Elias. More than I can say. Caring's not the same as loving. No. But maybe it's enough to start with. Something shifted in Elias's expression. Hope. Fragile and uncertain. Before either could say more, Tommy's voice called from downstairs, breaking the moment. Mama, Mr. Elias, come quick. One of the chickens laid an egg right in front of me. They shared a look that held understanding and possibility, then went downstairs to admire Tommy's discovery. But something had changed between them. Some wall had been breached, some truth acknowledged. They weren't just playing at being a family anymore. They were becoming one. The town's reaction to their marriage was mixed at best. When Elias and Nora appeared together at the general store that weekend, a deliberate public appearance suggested by Margaret, the whispers started immediately. Mrs. Patterson barely concealed her disapproval, though she took their money readily enough. Mrs. Crowley actually sniffed and turned her back when Nora tried to greet her. But there were others, quieter voices, who offered congratulations. Miss Maybelle, who'd witnessed the wedding, spread the word that it had been a lovely ceremony and the couple seemed genuinely happy. The blacksmith, a gruff man named Tomas, who'd done business with Elias for years, shook his hand and wished him well. About time you rejoined the living, Ward, Tomas said. That ranch of yours needs a woman's touch, and the boy there looks like he could use a father. Tommy, who'd been examining the blacksmith's tools with wide-eyed fascination, looked up at that. Mr. Elias is my pa now. He married Mama, so that makes him my pa, right? That's right, son, Tomas confirmed, and the genuine warmth in his voice made Nora's throat tight. But the positive reactions were outnumbered by the negative ones. By Monday, the gossip had spread that Vincent Gray was challenging the marriage in court, claiming it was fraudulent. The story grew with each telling. Some versions had Nora as a conniving opportunist who'd trapped poor Elias Ward. Others painted Elias as taking advantage of a desperate widow. The cruelty of it wore on Nora. She'd endured judgment before, but this felt different, more personal. Because it wasn't just her reputation at stake anymore. It was Elias's and Tommy's future. Don't listen to them, Elias told her one evening after a particularly difficult trip to town where a group of women had literally crossed the street to avoid them. Their opinions don't matter. They might matter to a judge. Then we'll find people whose opinions counter theirs. Margaret's working on that. And she was. Over the next week, Margaret interviewed everyone who'd had contact with the Ward family. The ranch hands gave statements about Elias's character and Nora's work ethic. Miss Maybelle testified that she'd witnessed the wedding and believed it to be genuine. Even Pastor Reynolds agreed to speak on their behalf, noting that while the courtship had been brief, both parties had seemed sincere in their vows. But Margaret's expression grew more concerned as the hearing date approached. Vincent's lawyer is building a strong case, she admitted during a strategy session 3 days before they were due in court. They're calling witnesses who'll testify to your previous living arrangement. The fact that you lived here unmarried for weeks before the wedding. They're bringing up the timing, the sudden nature of the marriage right before Vincent filed papers. And they're painting Vincent as a stable, established businessman who can provide Thomas with opportunities you can't. What opportunities? Nora demanded. Boarding school where he'll never see me? A cold household where he's just an heir to an inheritance Vincent wants to control? You're preaching to the converted, Mrs. Ward. I believe you, but we need to make the judge believe you. That means we need to prove Vincent's true motivations, and so far, I haven't found concrete evidence. His finances are messy, but not provably corrupt. He has gambling debts, but nothing that directly ties to Thomas's inheritance. So what do we do? Elias asked, his voice tight with frustration. We focus on what we can prove, that you're providing a stable, loving home, that Thomas is thriving here, that your marriage, while unconventional, is genuine, and we hope it's enough. Hope. Such a fragile thing to pin everything on. That night, Nora couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the house settle, to Tommy's soft breathing in the room beside hers, to the creak of floorboards as Elias moved around in his room. The walls between them felt simultaneously too thick and too thin. She must have finally dozed off because she woke to Tommy's scream. Nora bolted upright, her heart hammering. Tommy was sitting up in his small bed, crying, his face flushed with nightmare terror. "Baby, it's okay. Mama's here." "No, he's taking me away. Uncle Vincent is taking me, and you can't stop him, and I don't want to go, Mama. Please don't let him take me." "Shh, shh. You're safe. It was just a dream." Elias appeared in the doorway, hastily dressed, his face creased with concern. "What happened?" "Nightmare," Nora said, cradling Tommy against her chest. "About Vincent. About the hearing." Elias crossed the room in 3 strides and sat on the edge of the bed. Without hesitation, he reached out and placed a large hand on Tommy's small back. "Listen to me, son. Nobody's taking you anywhere. Not Vincent, not anyone. You're staying right here with your mama and with me. That's a promise. But what if the judge says I have to go?" Tommy's voice was muffled against Nora's shoulder. "What if he doesn't believe we're a real family?" "Then we'll make him believe it," Elias said firmly. "Because we are a real family. Maybe not the way most families start, but real all the same. You understand?" Tommy pulled back enough to look at Elias with red-rimmed eyes. "You really mean that? I'm really your son?" Something in Elias's expression cracked open. Nora watched, her breath caught, as this guarded man finally let down the last of his walls. "Yeah," Elias said, his voice rough. "You're really my son. Been thinking of you that way for a while now, even if I didn't say it out loud. And nobody, not Vincent, not a judge, not anyone, is going to change that. You're mine, and your mama's. Forever." "Forever, and then some?" Tommy asked, using a phrase he'd picked up from one of the ranch hands. "Forever, and then some," Elias confirmed. Tommy launched himself at Elias, wrapping small arms around his neck with the fierce grip only a frightened child can manage. Elias caught him, held him, and over Tommy's head, his eyes met Nora's. In that look, Nora saw everything they'd been dancing around for weeks. Not just care or affection or practical partnership. Love. Real, deep, impossible to deny love. For Tommy, certainly, but also, she dared to hope, for her. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. Elias nodded, his arms still wrapped around the boy who'd somehow become his son. They stayed like that until Tommy's breathing evened out in sleep. Elias carried him back to his small bed, tucking the covers around him with surprising gentleness. Then he and Nora stood together in the doorway, watching their son sleep. "He's terrified," Nora whispered. "He understands more than I thought." "Kids always do. But he'll be okay. We'll make sure of it." "How can you be so certain?" Elias looked at her, and in the dim lamplight, his expression was open in a way it had never been before. "Because I'm not losing another child. I couldn't save Sarah's babies, but I can save yours, ours. And I will, whatever it takes." "Elias, I know what I said, about this being practical, about not expecting anything beyond an arrangement. I meant it when I said it, but—" He stopped, struggling with words he clearly wasn't used to saying. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped being just a solution to a problem. You became someone I want to protect, someone I care about. Hell, Nora, you became someone I need, both of you. This family we've made, it's real to me, more real than anything's been in 5 years." Tears spilled down Nora's cheeks. "It's real to me too. I didn't want to admit it because I was afraid of caring again, afraid of losing again. But I can't pretend anymore. You're not just my husband on paper, Elias. You're—" She didn't get to finish because Elias kissed her. Not like the chaste brush at their wedding, but real and deep and full of all the things neither of them had been brave enough to say. Nora's hands came up to grip his shoulders, and she kissed him back with equal fervor, 5 years of grief and loneliness and fear dissolving into this moment of connection. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "Well," Nora managed, "that was, yeah." "Does this mean—" "It means I love you," Elias said bluntly. "Don't know when it happened, but I do. Love you and Tommy both. And if that changes things between us, if that makes you uncomfortable, it doesn't." Nora's smile was tremulous but real. "Because I love you too. I think I have for a while now. I was just too scared to admit it." Elias pulled her close, tucking her head under his chin, and for the first time since James died, Nora felt truly safe. Not just physically protected, but emotionally anchored, like she'd finally found the place she was meant to be. "We'll win this case," Elias murmured into her hair. "We'll prove to that judge that we're a real family, and Vincent will lose, and Tommy will stay right here where he belongs. I promise you that." "Don't make promises you can't keep." "I keep my promises, Nora, always have, and I'm promising you this. I will not let anyone take our son." "Our son?" The words settled into Nora's heart like a benediction. They stood there in the hallway, holding each other, until the lamp burned low and the prairie night deepened around them. Then they parted reluctantly, each retreating to their separate rooms, but something fundamental had changed. They weren't pretending anymore. They weren't performing for lawyers or judges or gossiping townsfolk. They were a family. Real and messy and complicated, yes, but real. And in 2 days, they'd have to prove it to a court of law. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and bright. Frost covered the prairie grass, and the air had the sharp clarity that comes with autumn turning toward winter. Nora dressed in her best, the gray dress she'd worn for the wedding, carefully pressed and mended. Elias wore his suit, and Tommy was buttoned into his good clothes, his hair combed flat despite his protests. They looked, Nora thought, like a proper family heading to church. She prayed they'd still be a family when the day was done. The courthouse in Guthrie was the imposing 2-story brick building that seemed designed to intimidate. The courtroom itself was all dark wood and hard benches, with a raised platform for the judge and witness stand to one side. Vincent was already there with his lawyer, Mr. Thornton, both looking confident and well-dressed. Vincent's smile when he saw them was pure calculation. "Nora, Elias, and little Thomas, don't you all look cozy?" "Save it for the judge," Margaret said sharply, steering them to their table. Judge Harriman entered precisely at 9 o'clock, a severe-looking man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He took his seat, arranged his papers, and called the court to order. "This is a custody hearing regarding Thomas Gray, also known as Thomas Ward," he began. "Mr. Vincent Gray is petitioning for custody, claiming the current living arrangement is not in the child's best interest. Mrs. Nora Ward and Mr. Elias Ward are opposing the petition. Mr. Thornton, you may begin." Vincent's lawyer stood, and Nora's heart sank. He was good. Smooth and persuasive, he painted a picture of Vincent as the concerned uncle, the responsible family member trying to rescue a child from an inappropriate situation. "Your Honor, the facts are simple. Mrs. Ward, then Mrs. Gray, arrived at Mr. Ward's ranch destitute and homeless. She lived there, unmarried, for several weeks before a sudden wedding took place, conveniently just before my client filed his custody petition. This hasty marriage is clearly a strategic move designed to block Mr. Gray's legitimate claim to his nephew. He called his first witness, Mrs. Crowley from town, who testified with relish about the scandal of Nora living at the ranch unmarried, how the whole town had talked about it, how the marriage had seemed suspicious. "It all happened so fast," Mrs. Crowley said primly. "One moment she's a widow woman living in sin, next moment she's married. Very convenient, if you ask me." Margaret cross-examined but couldn't shake the woman's testimony. The damage was done. Vincent himself took the stand next, all false sincerity and concern. "I love my brother James very much," he said smoothly. "When he died, I wanted to help Nora and Thomas, but she disappeared before I could. I've been searching for them for months. When I finally found them, I was horrified to discover my nephew living on a remote ranch with people he barely knew. I only want what's best for Thomas, a stable home, proper education, family who truly care about him. And you believe you can provide that? Thornton asked. Absolutely. I have a successful business, a comfortable home in Tulsa, connections that can ensure Thomas has every advantage. Compare that to a struggling ranch and a mother who was literally homeless weeks ago. Margaret's objection was sustained, but again, the words had landed. Then it was their turn. Margaret called Elias first. He took the stand stiffly, clearly uncomfortable, but his testimony was powerful in its honesty. Mrs. Gray, Mrs. Ward now, came to my ranch in desperate circumstances, he said. Her boy was sick, she was exhausted, and I helped them because it was the right thing to do. She worked for wages, same as any hand. The marriage came later, yes, but not because of Vincent Gray's threats. It came because... He paused, then looked directly at the judge. Because I fell in love with her, and with her son. They became my family. That's the truth of it. But the timing, Mr. Ward, Thornton pressed on cross-examination. You married Mrs. Gray just days before Mr. Gray filed his petition. Quite a coincidence. Not a coincidence, a necessity. Elias's voice was hard. Vincent Gray showed up making threats, claiming he'd take Tommy. I married Nora to protect her, yes, but also because I wanted to. Because by then I couldn't imagine them leaving. Because they'd become my family in the ways that matter. Thornton tried to rattle him, to make him admit the marriage was fraudulent, but Elias held firm. When he stepped down, Nora saw the judge making notes, his expression thoughtful. Nora testified next, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger as she told their story. The desperation that led her to Elias's ranch, his kindness, the way Tommy had blossomed under his care. My son was dying when we arrived, she said, looking directly at the judge. Mr. Ward saved his life. Then he gave us a home, gave Tommy a father, gave me a chance to be more than just a woman struggling to survive. Yes, we married quickly, but I've loved more slowly, and that didn't guarantee happiness either. Sometimes love comes fast, Your Honor. That doesn't make it less real. And if I return custody to Mr. Gray? The judge asked. What then? Then my son loses the first stability he's known in months. He loses a father who actually cares about him, not just about an inheritance. He loses his home, and I lose everything that matters. Nora's voice broke. Please, Your Honor, please don't take my son. Thornton's cross-examination was brutal, trying to paint her as an opportunist who'd seduced Elias for financial security. But Margaret's objections kept the worst of it out, and Nora held her ground. The ranch hands testified, Hank, Charlie, Pete, all speaking to Elias's character and the genuine nature of the family they'd witnessed forming. Miss Maybell testified about the wedding, her conviction that it was real bringing tears to her eyes. Finally, the judge called for a recess. I need time to review the evidence and testimony. We'll reconvene in 1 hour for my decision. That hour was the longest of Nora's life. They waited in a small room off the courthouse, Tommy clutching her hand with white-knuckled intensity, Elias pacing like a caged animal, Margaret reviewing her notes for the 100th time. I think it went well, Margaret said, but her tone was uncertain. The judge seemed moved by your testimony, Mrs. Ward, and Mr. Ward's straightforwardness worked in our favor. But Thornton made good points about the timing, and Vincent's financial stability is a real advantage. So you're saying we might lose? Nora could barely force the words out. I'm saying it's not certain either way. We wait and hope. When they were called back, the courtroom felt like a tomb. Judge Harriman took his seat, his expression grave. I've reviewed all testimony and evidence, he began. This is not an easy decision. On one hand, Mr. Gray has legitimate standing as the boy's uncle and undeniable financial resources. On the other, the Wards have provided a stable home and clearly have the child's affection. Nora's fingernails dug into her palms. Please, please. However, the judge continued, I cannot ignore certain facts. The marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Ward occurred with suspicious timing. The living arrangement prior to marriage was inappropriate. And while I believe the current situation is loving, I question whether it provides the long-term stability this child needs. No, oh God, no. Therefore, wait! A voice called from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned. A woman stood there, elderly, well-dressed, with sharp eyes and an imperious bearing. Who are you? Judge Harriman demanded. This is highly irregular. I'm Dorothy Gray, the woman said, walking forward with the aid of a cane. James Gray's mother, Thomas's grandmother, and I have something to say about this custody matter. Vincent went pale. Mother, what are you— Sit down, Vincent. Dorothy's voice cracked like a whip. She approached the bench. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but I've been following this case, and I can't in good conscience remain silent. You may speak, the judge said slowly, but make it brief. Dorothy turned to face the courtroom, her gaze settling on Vincent with withering contempt. My son Vincent is not petitioning for custody out of love or family duty. He's doing it for money. James left a trust for Thomas, $50,000, to be managed by the boy's guardian until he comes of age. Vincent has gambling debts totaling nearly that amount. He plans to use Thomas's inheritance to pay them off. The courtroom erupted. Vincent shot to his feet, his face red. That's a lie! Mother, how dare you! I dare because I have proof. Dorothy pulled papers from her bag. Bank statements showing Vincent's debts, letters from creditors threatening legal action, and this— she held up a document. A letter from Vincent to a business partner, explicitly stating his plan to gain custody of Thomas to access the trust funds. Judge Harriman took the papers, his expression darkening as he read. Mr. Gray, he said coldly, is this true? Vincent's mouth opened and closed. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. Finally, he sat down, defeated. I care about my nephew, he tried weakly. The money is secondary. The money is primary, Dorothy corrected. You've never shown interest in Thomas until now, never visited when James was alive, never offered help when Nora and the boy were destitute. You're using my grandson, Vincent, using him like you've used everyone in your life, and I won't allow it. She turned to Nora, and her expression softened. James loved you, my dear, loved you and your boy with everything in him. I didn't approve of your marriage initially. I was a foolish old woman who thought class and money mattered more than character. But I was wrong. You made my son happy, and you've been a good mother to Thomas. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you after James died. I'm here now. Nora couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She managed a nod, tears streaming down her face. Judge Harriman set down the papers. Mr. Gray, in light of this evidence, your petition for custody is denied. Furthermore, I'm ordering you to have no contact with Thomas Ward unless the child's parents explicitly allow it. If you violate this order, you'll face contempt charges. Am I clear? Yes, Your Honor, Vincent said, his voice hollow with defeat. The judge turned to Nora and Elias. Mr. and Mrs. Ward, while the circumstances of your marriage were unusual, I've seen enough today to convince me that you're acting in Thomas's best interest. The child will remain in your custody. This case is closed. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed like thunder. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Tommy launched himself at Nora, and she caught him, sobbing with relief and joy. Elias's arms came around both of them, his own eyes suspiciously bright. We won, Nora whispered. We actually won. Told you, Elias said roughly. Forever, and then some, remember? Dorothy approached, leaning on her cane. May I meet my grandson properly? Nora nodded, unable to speak. Tommy looked up at the elderly woman with curious eyes. Are you my grandma? He asked. I am. If you'll have me. Dorothy's voice was gentle. I know I wasn't there before, but I'd very much like to be part of your life now, if your parents agree. Tommy looked at Nora, who nodded through her tears. Then he threw his arms around Dorothy with the same enthusiasm he showed everything. I always wanted a grandma, he said simply. Vincent left the courthouse without a word, his lawyer hurrying after him. Margaret accepted congratulations from well-wishers, and in the center of it all, Nora stood with Elias, Tommy, and Dorothy, an unlikely family forged in crisis and cemented in love. Thank you, Nora said to Dorothy, for coming, for speaking up, for being braver than I could have asked. I should have been braver sooner, Dorothy replied. Should have stood by you after James died. I'm sorry for that, Nora. Truly. You're here now. That's what matters. As they prepared to leave, Miss Maybelle appeared with several other women from town. Not the gossipy ones who'd shunned them, but quieter folks who'd watched and waited to see how things turned out. "Mrs. Ward," Miss Maybell said, "we just wanted to say we're glad things worked out. You and Mr. Ward, you've got a good thing there. Don't let small minds tell you different." The words, simple as they were, meant everything. Nora thanked her, and Elias actually smiled, small but genuine. The ride back to the ranch was peaceful, Tommy chattering excitedly about having a grandma who promised to visit soon. Nora and Elias sat close on the wagon seat, his hand covering hers on the bench between them. "You were right," Nora said softly, "about keeping your promises. Told you, I always keep them. Then I need you to promise me something else." Elias glanced at her. "What's that?" "Promise me we'll make this real. Not just on paper, but in every way. That we'll build a life together, you and me and Tommy. A real family, not just for show, but for us." Elias brought the wagon to a stop right there in the middle of the empty prairie road. He turned to face her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she'd once thought impossible. "Nora Ward, I promise you a real marriage, a real family, a real life together. For as long as we both live. That good enough?" "More than good enough." She leaned in and kissed him, slow and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Tommy was making exaggerated gagging sounds from the back of the wagon. "Grown-ups are so gross," he declared, though he was grinning. "You'll understand when you're older," Elias said, the corners of his mouth twitching. "That's what everyone always says." They started moving again, the ranch appearing in the distance as the sun angled toward afternoon. Home. It had become home without Nora quite realizing when. This land, this house, this man beside her, all of it had woven itself into her heart until she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For finding us, for saving us, for loving us." Elias's hand tightened on hers. "You saved me too, Nora, brought me back to life when I thought I was done living. That's worth more than you know." As they pulled into the ranch yard, the hands emerged from the barn. Hank, Pete, and Charlie, all grinning and calling congratulations. Miss Maybell had apparently ridden ahead to spread the word, and now the whole ranch was celebrating. Charlie had even made a cake, lopsided and slightly burnt but made with genuine affection. "Figured if we won, we'd need cake," he explained. "And if we lost, we'd need cake even more." They ate on the porch as the sun set, the autumn air crisp and clean, Tommy sitting in Elias's lap and chattering about everything and nothing. Dorothy had promised to visit in 2 weeks, and Tommy was already planning what he'd show her. When the hands finally retreated to the bunkhouse and Tommy was tucked into bed, exhausted from the day's excitement, Nora and Elias found themselves alone on the porch. The stars were emerging, brilliant in the clear prairie sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. "Quite a day," Elias said. "Quite a life," Nora corrected. "I never imagined, when I collapsed on your land all those weeks ago, that this is where I'd end up. Happy, safe, loved." "Loved," Elias repeated, testing the word. Then, stronger. "Yeah, loved. By me. Completely." Nora leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I don't think you're broken," he'd said, weeks ago, in the immediate aftermath of Vincent's threat. The words had seemed out of nowhere then, but now Nora understood. He'd been speaking to himself as much as to her. Two broken people, finding each other, discovering that broken pieces could still fit together to make something whole. "Tomorrow," Elias said quietly, "I'd like to move my things into your room, if that's all right with you." Nora's heart skipped. "Are you sure? I know we said this was just for show." "It's not for show anymore. It's real. We're real. And I want to be your husband in every sense. If you want that too." "I do," Nora whispered. "I want all of it. All of you." "Then that's what you'll have. Starting tomorrow, we're not just husband and wife on paper. We're husband and wife in truth, a real marriage, a real family, everything we both lost and found again." They sat together as the night deepened, two survivors who'd built something beautiful from necessity and need. The road that had brought them here had been hard, marked by loss and grief and desperate choices. But it had led them home. to each other, to a family neither had expected, but both had needed more than they'd known. Inside, Tommy slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that he was loved and safe, that his family was whole and would remain so, that he had a mother who'd fought for him, and a father who'd chosen him, and a grandmother who'd finally found the courage to do right. And on the porch, Nora and Elias Ward held each other under the vast prairie sky, two hearts that had been empty, finally full, ready to face whatever came next. Together. Forever. And then some. The morning after their victory in court, Nora woke to find Elias's side of the bed already empty and cool to the touch. True to his word, he'd moved his belongings into her room the previous evening after they'd said goodnight to Tommy. There had been an awkwardness to it, this crossing of a threshold they'd both been dancing around, but also a rightness. When they'd finally lain down together in the darkness, Elias had pulled her close, and Nora had fallen asleep with her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Now, in the gray pre-dawn light, she found him at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the awakening prairie. He looked peaceful in a way she'd never seen him. Shoulders relaxed, the constant tension he carried finally eased. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly. He turned, and his smile was small but genuine. "Slept better than I have in 5 years, actually. Just woke early out of habit. Didn't want to disturb you." Nora poured herself coffee and joined him. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, painting everything in shades of rose and gold. It was going to be a beautiful day. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find out yesterday was a dream," she admitted. "That we didn't really win, that Tommy's not really safe. It was real. We won. He's safe." Elias reached across the table and took her hand. "And we get to figure out what comes next, together." What came next, as it turned out, was life. Beautiful, ordinary, complicated life. Tommy adjusted to calling Elias Pa with the easy acceptance of childhood. Within days, it was as if there'd never been any other name for the man who taught him to ride, who carved him toys in the evenings, who listened patiently to his endless stream of questions about everything from why cows had 4 stomachs to whether stars were really just holes in the sky letting heaven's light through. "Pa, look what I found," became a constant refrain. Tommy dragging Elias over to examine interesting rocks, unusual bugs, a bird's nest that had fallen from a tree. And Elias, who'd spent 5 years speaking as little as possible, found himself explaining the world to a curious 4-year-old with something approaching joy. Nora watched these interactions with a fullness in her chest that sometimes made it hard to breathe. This was what she'd wanted for Tommy, a father who was present, engaged, loving. She'd never imagined finding it in a silent rancher who'd been more ghost than man when they first met. The ranch hands noticed the change too. Hank cornered Nora one afternoon while she was hanging laundry. "Don't know what you did to the boss, ma'am, but he's a different man. Smiled yesterday. Actually smiled, not just that thing he does with his mouth when he's being polite. Haven't seen that since Miss Sarah was alive." "I think we saved each other," Nora said simply. "He gave us a home, and we gave him a reason to live in it. Well, whatever it is, keep doing it. Place feels alive again." The town's attitude shifted gradually, like ice melting under a reluctant spring sun. Mrs. Crowley and her ilk still sniffed disapprovingly when Nora passed, but they were outnumbered now by people who'd heard about the court case, who'd seen Vincent Gray exposed as the manipulative fortune hunter he was, who'd witnessed Dorothy Gray publicly embrace her daughter-in-law and grandson. Miss Maybelle became a regular visitor, bringing fresh eggs and gossip in equal measure. She'd taken to Tommy immediately, and the boy had adopted her as a sort of honorary aunt. Other women began following her lead, tentatively at first, then with growing warmth. An invitation to a quilting bee, a friendly wave at church, small gestures that added up to acceptance. "You're one of us now," Miss Maybelle said one afternoon over tea. "A proper rancher's wife. The old biddies can fuss all they want, but facts are facts. You and Elias have something real, and folks can see it." Nora thought about that conversation later, alone in the kitchen while preparing dinner. Something real. Yes, that's exactly what they had. It had started as a transaction, evolved into a strategy, and somehow transformed into genuine partnership, into love. The physical aspect of their marriage had unfolded gradually, naturally, like everything else between them. That first night sharing a bed, they'd simply held each other. The second night, Elias had kissed her goodnight, soft and sweet and full of restrained want. By the end of the first week, the restraint had burned away, replaced by passionate need and tender discovery. Elias was a careful lover, attentive and patient, always making sure Nora was comfortable and willing. There was a vulnerability to him in those intimate moments, a dropping of the walls he kept up for the rest of the world. Sometimes afterward, he'd trace patterns on her skin and talk about Sarah, about the guilt he'd carried for not being able to save her, about how loving Nora felt like both betrayal and redemption. "She'd want you to be happy," Nora would tell him, "to live, not just survive." "I know, doesn't make it less complicated." Love is always complicated, but that doesn't make it wrong. 2 weeks after the hearing, Dorothy Gray arrived for her promised visit. She came in a hired carriage loaded with gifts, toys for Tommy, books for the house, practical items like new linens and kitchen equipment. But more valuable than any material gift was her presence itself, the bridge she was building to the grandson she'd neglected. Tommy took to her immediately, charmed by this grandmother who listened to his stories with genuine interest and didn't talk down to him. Dorothy, for her part, seemed determined to make up for lost time. "He has James's eyes," she said to Nora one evening while Tommy was showing Elias a trick he'd learned with his wooden horse, "and his father's gentle nature. You've done well with him, Nora, despite everything." "I had help," Nora replied, nodding toward Elias. Dorothy followed her gaze. "Yes, Mr. Ward is quite something, isn't he? Not what I would have chosen for you, perhaps, but exactly what you needed. Sometimes life works out better than our careful plans." "I'm learning that." Dorothy stayed for a week, and by the time she left, she'd extracted promises of regular visits and letters. She'd also quietly handed Nora papers related to Tommy's trust fund, properly administered now, safe from Vincent's grasping hands. "James wanted this for his son's education and future," Dorothy explained. "It'll be there when Thomas needs it. In the meantime, I've arranged for a small monthly allowance to help with expenses. Not charity," she added quickly when Nora started to protest. "Investment in my grandson's well-being. Please accept it." Nora did, touched by the gesture and the implicit acknowledgement that while Elias could provide for them, every little bit helped a growing family. As autumn deepened into winter, the ranch settled into new rhythms. Morning chores done together, Tommy helping, with enthusiasm, if not efficiency. Midday meals with the hands, the kitchen filled with warmth and conversation. Evenings in the parlor, Elias working on ranch accounts while Nora mended or read, Tommy playing on the floor until he fell asleep and had to be carried to bed. These were the moments Nora treasured most, the quiet, ordinary ones that made up a life. Nothing dramatic or exciting, just the steady accumulation of days lived together. Shared glances across the dinner table, Elias's hand finding hers while they sat on the porch, Tommy's laughter echoing through the house. But not everything was peaceful. Winter brought its own challenges. In late November, a storm rolled in with unexpected fury, bringing snow and wind that howled like demons around the house. The cattle had to be moved to shelter, the horses secured in the barn. Elias and the hands worked around the clock, and Nora kept coffee and food coming, knowing the men needed fuel to work in such brutal conditions. On the second night of the storm, Elias came in half frozen, his face gray with exhaustion. Nora had hot water ready, strong coffee, a plate of stew that he ate mechanically while she removed his boots. "Lost 3 head," he said flatly. "Found them too late. The cold got them." "I'm sorry." Nora knelt before him, rubbing feeling back into his feet. "How are the others?" "Safe now, but if this keeps up—" He stopped, his jaw tight with worry. "It won't. Storm will break tomorrow, you'll see." "You a fortune teller now?" "No, just stubborn. And I refuse to believe we survived everything we did just to lose the ranch to weather." That got a ghost of a smile from him. "Your stubbornness might be my favorite thing about you." "Just one of many excellent qualities," Nora replied, standing to kiss his forehead. "Now finish eating and get some sleep. You're no good to anyone exhausted." The storm did break the next day, and the damage, while real, was manageable. 3 cattle lost was painful, but not devastating. The rest of the herd had survived, and as the sun emerged to glitter on snow-covered prairie, Elias allowed himself to breathe again. "We'll rebuild what we lost come spring," he told the hands, "and we'll be smarter next time. Build better shelters, plan better. We learn and adapt. That's how we survive." It was a philosophy that applied to more than just ranching, Nora thought. They'd all been learning and adapting, taking the broken pieces of their pasts and building something new. Christmas came quietly. Dorothy sent gifts by post, and Miss Maybelle organized a small gathering at the ranch with neighboring families. It was Nora's first real Christmas in years. The previous one had been marked by fresh grief and desperate poverty. Now she had a home decorated with pine boughs, a tree that Tommy had helped choose and decorate, and more food than they could possibly eat. Elias gave Tommy a leather holster with a wooden gun he'd carved himself, child-sized and perfect for the boys' endless games of cowboys and outlaws. He gave Nora a cameo brooch that had belonged to his mother, presented awkwardly but with clear intention. "Figure you should have something that's just yours," he said. "Something that says you belong to this family, this place." Nora's gift to him was simpler but just as meaningful. A photograph of the three of them, taken by a traveling photographer who'd come through town the previous month. In the image, Elias stood with his hand on Tommy's shoulder while Nora leaned into his side. They looked, Nora thought, like exactly what they were, a family. Elias stared at the photograph for a long time, his expression working through emotions he couldn't name. Finally, he set it on the mantel, right next to Sarah's picture, not replacing it, but joining it. "Both parts of my life," he said quietly. "Past and present. Grief and joy. I need both to be whole." Nora understood. She still wore James's ring on a chain around her neck, still thought of him with love and sadness. The dead didn't need to be forgotten for the living to be honored. That night, after Tommy was asleep and the house was quiet, Elias and Nora made love slowly, tenderly, and afterward lay tangled together in the darkness. "Never thought I'd have this again," Elias murmured against her hair. "A family, a home that feels alive, someone to wake up to." "Neither did I. Guess we're both lucky. More than lucky. Blessed." It was the first time Nora had heard him use that word, and it filled her with quiet joy. Winter gave way to spring with the usual prairie drama. Sudden thaws followed by late freezes, mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels, the gradual greening of grass and emergence of wildflowers. The ranch came alive with new calves and foals, and Tommy appointed himself official helper, much to everyone's amusement. In March, Nora realized she'd missed her monthly courses. At first, she told herself it was stress or the change of seasons or any number of things. But when the nausea started and her breasts became tender, she couldn't deny the truth. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She'd been pregnant once before, with Tommy, and that pregnancy had been normal and easy. But she'd also watched Sarah's story through Elias's grief-stricken recounting, 2 pregnancies that ended in tragedy, a woman who died trying to bring new life into the world. For 3 days, Nora kept the knowledge to herself, warring with fear and hope. Finally, she told Miss Maybelle, who'd become her closest confidant. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful news," Miss Maybelle exclaimed, then saw Nora's expression. "Unless it's not? Are you not happy?" "I'm terrified," Nora admitted. "What if something goes wrong? What if I can't carry to term? Or if the birth goes badly? Or Elias lost everything the last time. I can't do that to him again." "Now you listen to me." Miss Maybelle took Nora's hands firmly. "You're not Sarah. Every pregnancy is different, and modern medicine has come a long way. We'll get you to a proper doctor, make sure everything's monitored. But you can't live in fear of what might happen. You'll drive yourself mad." "I know. I need to tell Elias, and I don't know how. How do I tell him I'm carrying his child when the last time—" "You tell him straight. Give him credit for being strong enough to handle it. That man has been through hell and come out the other side. He can handle joy too, even if it comes with fear attached." So that evening, after Tommy was in bed and Elias was going over the ranch books, Nora approached him with her heart in her throat. "Elias, I need to tell you something." He looked up, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. At least, I hope it's not wrong. She took a breath. I'm pregnant. About 2 months along, I think. The color drained from Elias's face. For a long moment, he just stared at her, and Nora's heart sank. This was what she'd feared, that the news would bring back all his trauma, all his loss. Then he stood, crossed to her, and pulled her into his arms with desperate intensity. You're pregnant, he repeated, his voice muffled against her hair. We're going to have a baby. Yes. Are you... Is this okay? I know after what happened with Sarah. Don't! Elias pulled back enough to cup her face in his hands. Don't compare this to that. This is different. You're different. We're different. And yes, I'm scared half to death, but I'm also... His voice cracked. I'm happy, Nora. Terrified and happy, and I can't believe we get this chance. Relief flooded through her. I was so afraid you'd... I won't lie and say I'm not worried. The memories are there, and they're hard. But this baby, our baby, deserves better than a father paralyzed by fear, so we'll be careful, we'll get good medical care, and we'll hope. That's all we can do. Hope, Nora repeated. I can do that. They told Tommy a few days later, and his reaction was pure, uncomplicated joy. A baby? A real baby? That I can play with? Eventually, Nora said, laughing. Babies are very small at first. They mostly just eat and sleep. That's boring. When will it be fun? In a few years. Tommy considered this. Okay, but it better be a good baby, not a crying one. All babies cry, son, Elias said, his hand resting protectively on Nora's still flat stomach. It's how they talk. Then I'll teach it to talk right. With words. As spring progressed into summer, Nora's pregnancy became visible. Her body changed, swelling with new life, and Elias was almost comically protective. He wouldn't let her lift anything heavy, insisted she rest more than she wanted, and watched her constantly for any sign of distress. I'm pregnant, not made of glass, Nora finally said after he'd forbidden her from hanging laundry. Women work right up until they give birth. Not my wife, they don't. Elias Ward, if you wrap me in cotton wool, I'll go mad. I need to feel useful. They compromised. Nora could do lighter tasks, but nothing that required lifting or strenuous effort. It chafed, but she understood his fear. And honestly, as her belly grew larger and her energy waned, she appreciated not having to do everything she'd done before. Dorothy visited twice during the pregnancy, fussing over Nora and making lists of everything the baby would need. She'd arranged for a proper doctor from Guthrie to attend the birth, paying his fee without being asked. My grandchild will have the best care available, she said firmly. I've already lost too much. I won't risk losing more. The baby arrived on October evening, just as the prairie was settling into autumn's golden light. Nora's labor started mid-afternoon with a low backache that gradually intensified into contractions. By evening, they were regular and strong, and Miss Maybelle, who'd attended dozens of births, sent Hank racing to fetch the doctor. Elias was a wreck. He paced outside the bedroom, his face gray with barely controlled panic. While inside, Nora labored with Miss Maybelle's steady encouragement. You're doing fine, honey. Just breathe through it. That's right. The doctor will be here soon. But the baby had other ideas. The doctor arrived just in time to catch a squalling, red-faced infant who entered the world angry and loud. A good sign, Miss Maybelle said. Strong lungs meant strong life. It's a girl, the doctor announced, cleaning the baby and wrapping her in soft cloth. Small but healthy. Congratulations, Mrs. Ward. Nora, exhausted and euphoric, held her daughter for the first time and wept. She was perfect, tiny and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. Dark hair like Elias, nose like Nora, and her father's dark eyes already alert and curious about this strange new world. Elias, Miss Maybelle called to the door. You can come in now. He entered slowly, his face a mask of fear and hope. When he saw Nora sitting up, holding the baby, alive and well and smiling, something in him broke open. He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the bed. Nora, are you? We're both fine. Perfect. Come meet your daughter. Elias looked at the tiny bundle in Nora's arms with wonder and terror. She's so small. She'll grow. Here. Nora carefully transferred the baby to Elias's arms, showing him how to support her head. Say hello to your pa, little one. The baby yawned, unconcerned with the momentous occasion, and made a small mewling sound. Elias stared down at her, and tears began sliding down his weathered face. She's really here. Really alive. Really ours. Really ours, Nora confirmed. What should we name her? They'd discussed names but never settled on one, waiting to see what felt right once the baby arrived. Now, holding his daughter, Elias said quietly, Hope. I want to name her Hope. Hope, Nora repeated, testing it. Hope Ward. It's perfect. Hope Sarah Ward, Elias added, for what she represents and what came before. If that's all right with you. It's more than all right. It's beautiful. Tommy was allowed in next, creeping forward cautiously to peer at his new sister. She's really small, he observed, and kind of red. She'll get bigger and less red, Elias assured him. But she's your sister, Tommy. That means you have to help protect her and teach her things. Think you can do that? Tommy straightened, taking the responsibility seriously. I can do that. I'll be the best big brother ever. I know you will, son. The first weeks with Hope were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. She woke every few hours to nurse, cried with impressive volume, and required constant attention. But she was also perfect. The soft weight of her in Nora's arms, the milky smell of her breath, the way she'd grasp Nora's finger with her tiny hand and hold on with surprising strength. Elias was besotted. When Nora was too exhausted to function, he'd walk the floors with Hope, murmuring to her about the ranch, about horses and cattle, about the prairie stars. Tommy helped in his 4-year-old way, fetching diapers and singing to his sister when she fussed. They were, Nora thought during one particularly sleepless night, a real family in every sense, messy and complicated and bound together by love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances. Winter came again, their second on the ranch, but this time they were prepared. Better shelters for the cattle, more supplies laid in, systems in place. The storm that hit in January was fierce, but they weathered it with minimal losses. Spring brought Hope's first birthday, a small celebration with cake and presents, and Tommy insisting his sister needed a wooden horse like his, even though she was far too young to play with it yet. Elias carved one anyway, setting it aside for when she was older. Summer saw Tommy turn 5 and start learning to read from books Dorothy sent. He was bright and curious, soaking up knowledge like prairie soil soaking up rain. Elias taught him about the ranch, showing him how to care for animals, how to read weather signs, how to be responsible. He'll make a good rancher someday, Elias told Nora one evening while they watched Tommy carefully brush one of the gentler horses. If that's what he wants, and if it's not, then he'll be good at whatever he chooses. We'll make sure he has options, education, opportunities. He won't be limited by circumstance like we were. We turned out all right. We survived. I want more than survival for our kids. I want them to thrive. Our kids. The casual way he said it, including Tommy without distinction from Hope, made Nora's heart swell. That fall, Dorothy moved permanently to a house in Redemption, declaring that she was too old to keep traveling back and forth and she wanted to be close to her grandchildren. Her presence became a regular fixture in their lives. Weekly dinners, impromptu visits, help with the children when Nora and Elias needed it. Never thought I'd end up a frontier grandmother, she said one evening, dandling Hope on her knee while Tommy showed her his latest drawings. But I have to say, I prefer this to Tulsa society. More real, more honest. No regrets about leaving? Nora asked. Only that I didn't do it sooner. Family matters more than status, Nora. Took me too long to learn that, but I learned it. By their second anniversary, life had settled into comfortable patterns. The ranch was thriving, expanded with additional land purchased from a neighbor who decided to move east. The cattle herd had grown to 300 head, requiring 2 additional hands who lived in the expanded bunkhouse. Financially, they were stable, not wealthy, but comfortable enough that Nora no longer worried about where the next meal would come from. Tommy's trust fund sat untouched, growing for his future. Hope was healthy and hitting all her milestones. The house was filled with life and laughter. On their anniversary evening, Elias surprised Nora with a picnic up on the ridge overlooking the ranch. They left the children with Dorothy and rode out together, carrying blankets and food and a bottle of wine Dorothy had gifted them. The view from the ridge was spectacular, miles of prairie stretching in every direction, the ranch buildings small but solid below, cattle dotting the landscape like dark stones. The sun was setting, painting everything in gold and crimson. "I used to come up here after Sarah died," Elias said as they spread the blanket. "Sit and think about whether any of it was worth it. The ranch, the work, the endless days. Couldn't see the point anymore. And now? Now I see everything. The life we've built, the family we're raising, the future instead of just the past." He pulled her close. "You gave me that, Nora. You and the kids. You gave me reasons to keep going. You gave us reasons too. Safety, home, love we didn't dare hope for." They ate and watched the stars emerge, talking about everything and nothing. Plans for the ranch, concerns about the children, memories of how they'd met. "I still can't believe you opened your barn to us," Nora said. "A desperate woman and her sick child. You could have sent us away. Couldn't have lived with myself if I had. And I'm selfish enough to be glad I didn't. Can't imagine life without you now. Any of you. Good, because you're stuck with us. Forever and then some, remember? Forever and then some," Elias agreed, kissing her softly. As full darkness fell and they prepared to head back, Nora looked out over the ranch one more time. Somewhere down there, their children slept safely. Their home stood solid against the prairie wind. Their life, built from desperation and determination and unexpected love, continued its steady rhythm. She thought of that first day, stumbling onto Elias's land with death breathing down her neck and nowhere else to turn. She'd been looking for temporary shelter, a brief respite before moving on to wherever the road led next. Instead, she'd found forever. Not the neat fairy tale forever of storybooks, but the messy, real forever of actual life, complete with hard work and difficult moments and fears that never quite went away, but also with joy and love and the daily miracle of waking up safe and wanted. "Ready to go home?" Elias asked, holding out his hand. Nora took it, letting him pull her to her feet. "Always." They rode back through the darkness, guided by starlight and the lamp Miss Maybelle had left burning in the window. As they approached, they could see Dorothy through the window, rocking Hope, while Tommy sat at her feet, playing with his wooden horses. Home. Family. Everything Nora had lost and found again in the most unexpected way. "Thank you," she said to Elias as they dismounted. "For what?" "For being brave enough to open your door. For caring enough to let us stay. For loving us enough to make us yours. Nora Ward, I'm the one who should be thanking you. You brought light back into a house that had been dark for too long. You and Tommy and Hope. You're my second chance. My redemption." "Then we saved each other," Nora said simply. "And we'll keep saving each other, every day, for as long as we live." They walked into the house together, greeted by Tommy's excited chatter about the baby saying a new sound and Dorothy's amused commentary. Hope reached for Elias with chubby arms, and he scooped her up, pressing a kiss to her dark curls. Tommy attached himself to Nora's skirts, showing her a picture he'd drawn of their family, stick figures holding hands in front of a house with a barn. "This is us," he explained unnecessarily, "all together, forever." "Forever and then some," Nora agreed, meeting Elias's eyes over the children's heads. In that moment, with her family gathered around her and lamplight warming the kitchen of their prairie home, Nora understood that this was what redemption looked like. Not dramatic or perfect, but real and earned. Built one day at a time by people who refused to let their broken past define their futures. The prairie wind sang its endless song outside, carrying away the old sorrows and bringing in new possibilities. And inside, the Ward family, forged in desperation, cemented in determination, perfected in love, settled in for another peaceful evening. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The ranch would need tending, the children would need raising, life would continue its complicated dance, but they'd face it together, this unlikely family bound not by blood alone, but by choice and commitment and love fierce enough to overcome anything. Some stories begin with once upon a time. This one began with a woman at the end of her rope and a man at the end of his hope. And it ended, or rather continued, with both of them finding exactly what they needed in the last place they expected to look, in each other. Forever, and then some. The end.